Before we descend into the darkness, I want to ask a favor. If you enjoy this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference. And if you'd like, comment what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. Long before the rhythm of alarm clocks and calendars, before the invention of agriculture or the construction of permanent dwellings, human beings lived in a fundamentally different relationship with time and space. This wasn't the dramatic, dangerous existence often portrayed in popular imagination, but rather something quieter and more rhythmic, a life organized around natural cycles, measured in the movement of the sun across the sky, the changing of seasons, and the basic needs of the body. To understand what an ordinary day might have felt like for early humans living in small groups tens of thousands of years ago, we need to set aside our modern expectations of what makes life interesting or noteworthy. There were no grand adventures to pursue, no appointments to keep, no distant goals requiring years of planning. Instead, there was the immediate world, the people nearby, the landscape underfoot, the weather overhead, and the simple, recurring tasks that kept everyone fed, warm, and together. A child born into such a group would have no concept of formal education, no classroom or curriculum. Learning happened through immersion in daily life, through watching and copying the movements of others. From the earliest age, a child's world was fundamentally social, defined by the faces that appeared each morning, the voices that spoke in familiar patterns, the hands that guided and corrected and reassured. The group itself was the classroom, and every action performed by an adult was a potential lesson. When someone prepared food, the child watched. When someone carried water, the child observed the careful balance required. When the group moved from one place to another, the child learned to stay close, to match pace, to understand without words that distance from the group meant danger. This kind of learning required no explanation in the modern sense. There were no lectures about why certain plants were safe to eat and others were not. Instead, a child learned through repeated exposure, watching which plants were gathered, which were ignored, which were handled carefully, and which were approached without hesitation. The child learned to recognize safe water not through a lesson about bacteria or contamination, but by seeing where adults filled containers, by noticing which streams were used again and again, by understanding through pattern that some sources were trusted and others avoided. This was learning as a slow accumulation of observations, each one reinforcing the last, building a mental map of the world that was practical and immediate rather than abstract. The physical skills required for daily life were absorbed in the same gradual way. Carrying objects without spilling required practice. Countless small attempts, gentle corrections, and the natural feedback of water sloshing over the edge or food tumbling from a container. A child learned to adjust grip, to walk more smoothly, to anticipate the movement of liquid inside a vessel. These weren't skills that could be taught in a single demonstration. They emerged from repetition, from the body itself discovering the most efficient way to accomplish a task. Similarly, sitting quietly when adults needed to focus was learned through experience. A child who made noise at the wrong moment would receive a gentle signal, a look, a gesture, a quiet sound, and over time would internalize the rhythm of when to be active and when to be still. The social texture of childhood was rich with these small, continuous adjustments. Learning to share food, to take turns, to understand when someone else needed space or help. All of this happened through daily interaction rather than explicit instruction. The group's expectations were communicated through consistent response rather than rules stated in advance. A child who grabbed food without waiting learned from the reactions of others. A child who wandered too far learned from being retrieved. The world taught through consequence, but in a gentle, patient way, because the group's survival depended on each member eventually understanding how to participate in the collective rhythm. As childhood progressed, tools became part of daily experience, but tools were not introduced as abstract technology or impressive achievements of human ingenuity. Instead, they were simply objects that made certain tasks easier, extensions of the hand that reduced effort or improved results. A child might first encounter a stone with a sharp edge by watching it being used, seeing how it could slice through plant fibers that fingers alone couldn't tear, or how it could separate meat from bone more efficiently than pulling. The tool itself was unremarkable in appearance, just a piece of stone, with one edge sharper than the rest, but its utility was obvious through demonstration. Learning to create such tools was a slow process, built on observation and imitation. There was no dramatic moment of discovery, no sudden flash of insight. Instead, there was the patient work of shaping stone, a process that required attention and practice. A young person learning to make a cutting edge would watch someone more experienced, noting which stones were selected, how they were held, the angle of the strike, the sound of successful fracture versus unsuccessful. Then came the attempts, many of them producing nothing useful, the stone crumbling wrong or refusing to break cleanly. But with the repetition, the hands learned. The body memorized the weight of the stone, the force required, the subtle adjustments that increased the likelihood of success. This work was not dramatic or urgent. It happened during quiet moments, during the slower parts of the day when immediate survival needs were met. Someone might sit in the shade and work on improving a tool, the rhythmic tapping becoming background sound. The focused attention, similar to any craft that requires precision. The finished product was evaluated not for its beauty, but for its functionality. Did it cut well? Did the edge hold? Could it be used comfortably? A good tool was one that worked reliably, that made daily tasks slightly easier, that could be used again and again until it wore down and needed to be replaced or resharpened. The relationship between people and tools was fundamentally practical. Tools were maintained because they were useful, repaired when possible, and replaced when necessary. There was no accumulation of unused objects, no collection of tools kept for future possibilities. What was made was what was needed, and what was no longer needed was often discarded or left behind. This created a different relationship with objects than modern humans experience. Tools were valued for their immediate utility rather than their potential future use or their status as possessions. The concept of a home base or camp was similarly practical. Whether the group sheltered in a cave, constructed simple windbreaks from branches and hides, or returned seasonally to a favored location, the purpose was always the same: to have a place where the essential activities of life could be organized efficiently. Water needed to be nearby, or at least accessible within a reasonable walk. The location needed to offer some protection from weather, wind, rain, extreme heat, or cold. It needed to be defensible in a general sense, meaning there was some awareness of surroundings, some ability to see or hear if anything approached, and it needed to be in a region where food could be obtained without traveling to the point of exhaustion. Within this base, much of life revolved around organizing and managing resources. Water was perhaps the most fundamental need, requiring daily attention. Containers needed to be filled, water needed to be kept clean, and everyone needed to drink regularly. Food preparation took considerable time. Gathering edible plants, processing them to make them more digestible, preparing anything that had been obtained through hunting or scavenging. Warmth was managed through clothing, through shelter, and through fire. Rest required safe sleeping areas, places where people could relax without constant vigilance. Fire occupied a special place in this organization of daily life. It was not always a large, roaring blaze that would waste fuel and require constant attention. Instead, fire was often a modest, carefully maintained heat source. Small flames, glowing coals, just enough warmth to cook food or provide comfort in cold weather. The skill lay not in creating the largest fire, but in keeping a manageable fire alive with minimal fuel. This required attention to detail, arranging fuel so it burned slowly, protecting the fire from wind or rain, banking coals at night so they would still be warm in the morning, feeding the fire gradually rather than overwhelming it. Tending fire was not a single person's responsibility, but a shared awareness. Anyone passing the fire might add a stick if the flames were low. Someone sitting nearby would notice if sparks threatened to spread beyond the fire area and would adjust accordingly. Children learned to respect fire's heat without being paralyzed by fear of it, understanding that it was useful and dangerous simultaneously, that it required care and attention. The fire became a kind of living presence in the camp, something that needed to be fed and protected, that offered benefits in return for that care. The continuity of fire was practically important, but also emotionally significant. A fire that burned continuously day after day represented stability. It meant the group had enough fuel, enough knowledge to maintain it, enough organization to ensure it didn't go out during the night. When fire did go out, it could be restarted, but that required effort and time. Striking stones together to create sparks, using friction methods that demanded patience and proper materials, or borrowing fire from another group if one was nearby. Keeping fire alive was easier than creating it anew, so fire became something to preserve, a small but important continuity, linking each day to the next. As young people moved through adolescence, their range expanded. The immediate area around the camp became deeply familiar, but beyond that were the routes and paths that connected the camp to resources. A water source might require a walk of 20 minutes or several hours, depending on season and location. Gathering areas for specific plants might be scattered across the landscape, each one visited when its particular resource was ready. Places where useful stone could be found, where certain animals were likely to appear, where the terrain offered advantages for specific tasks. All of these became part of a mental map built through repeated travel. Walking was the primary mode of movement, and bodies adapted to it through constant practice. Not the hurried walking of someone late for an appointment, but the steady, sustainable pace of someone covering distance day after day. The gait that minimized energy expenditure that could be maintained for hours without exhaustion. Feet grew tough from contact with the ground, learning to read terrain through sensation, where to step carefully, where to move quickly, how to adjust for slope or loose stone or wet surfaces. Legs developed the endurance to carry body weight, plus whatever was being transported, whether that was water, food, tools, or materials for shelter. Carrying methods evolved to make this easier. Weight distributed across the body was easier to manage than weight held in the arms. Materials could be bundled and slung over shoulders or carried in containers made from animal hide or woven plant fibers. Young children who couldn't keep pace were carried by adults, adding to the load, but ensuring the group could move together. The elderly or injured who struggled with distance were supported, the group's pace adjusting to accommodate them. Within reason, travel was a collective activity, and the group moved as a unit, maintaining visual and auditory contact, pausing when someone needed rest, resuming when everyone was ready. The landscape was not a generic wilderness, but a specific, known environment. Each season brought changes that were predictable from experience. Certain plants produced edible parts at certain times of year. Water sources that flowed abundantly in wet seasons might dwindle or disappear in dry periods. Animal movements followed patterns related to food availability, breeding seasons, and weather. The group's knowledge of these patterns was practical and detailed, accumulated over generations and taught through example and experience. Food acquisition was less about dramatic hunts and more about the steady, reliable work of gathering. Plants formed the foundation of the diet for most groups. Roots that could be dug from the ground, leaves and shoots that could be picked, seeds and nuts that could be collected and stored briefly, fruits when they were in season. This work required knowledge about what was edible, what was toxic, what needed processing to become safe or palatable. It required knowing where to look, when to return to a productive area, how much to take without depleting the source so it couldn't regenerate. The intelligence involved in gathering was considerable but rarely dramatic. It meant remembering that a particular type of tuber grew in sandy soil near certain trees, and that those trees were more common on south-facing slopes. It meant knowing that after rainfall, mushrooms would appear in specific areas, and that some were nutritious while others would cause illness. It meant understanding that certain seeds were easier to process if collected before they fully dried, while others were better after drying. This knowledge was specific to the local environment, meaning groups in different regions developed entirely different expertise about completely different plants. Gathering was also relatively safe and predictable compared to other forms of food acquisition. Plants didn't run away or fight back. The work was methodical, walking to a known location, searching systematically, collecting what was found, processing it if necessary, and returning to camp. It could be done alone or in small groups by people of various ages and physical abilities. Children could participate from a young age, learning to identify plants and practicing collection techniques. Elderly individuals who could no longer manage long hunting expeditions could still contribute by gathering. The cumulative result was that gathering often provided the majority of calories for the group, day after day, without requiring exceptional luck or skill. When hunting occurred, it was typically a group effort requiring planning and coordination. The dramatic image of a lone hunter pursuing large game was far less common than cooperative strategies. Some hunting involved driving animals toward natural barriers where they could be more easily caught. Some involved coordinating to surround prey or to take advantage of terrain. Some involved patience, waiting near water sources or along known animal paths, remaining still for long periods, acting only when opportunity presented itself clearly. The motivation for hunting was practical rather than recreational. Meat provided concentrated calories and specific nutrients that were harder to obtain from plants alone. Animal hides offered material for clothing and shelter. Bones could be used for tools, but hunting was also risky, requiring significant energy expenditure with no guarantee of success. An unsuccessful hunt meant wasted time and calories burned without return. So hunting was approached carefully, with attention to increasing the likelihood of success and minimizing danger. The actual process was less about individual heroism and more about competent execution of a shared plan. One person might spot game and signal others quietly. The group might spread out to strategic positions. Someone might be designated to make the first move, while others closed off escape routes. The goal was efficiency, a quick, clean kill that minimized animal suffering and minimized risk to hunters. There was no glory in prolonged struggle, no benefit to making the process harder than necessary. Success meant food for the group. Failure meant trying again another day. When a kill was made, the work of processing began immediately. Meat needed to be separated from bone, divided into portions, sometimes partially prepared on site before being transported. Nothing was wasted if it could be used. Organs were often consumed quickly, as they didn't preserve well. Bones were kept for tools or to extract marrow. Hide was carefully removed to avoid damage. This work required knowledge and skill, understanding anatomy well enough to work efficiently, knowing which cuts were most valuable, managing the practical challenges of handling heavy, slippery materials. Transportation of meat back to camp was another coordinated effort, particularly if the kill was large. The group would carry what it could, sometimes making multiple trips, sometimes processing the animal in stages if moving everything at once was impractical. Predators might be attracted to the remains, so there was awareness of not lingering unnecessarily. The successful hunt was a burst of abundance, but also a burst of intensive work. The meat needed to be distributed, shared according to group norms, prepared for immediate consumption, or preserved, if possible, through drying or smoking. Community cohesion was built and maintained through these shared activities. Food distribution followed patterns that might seem complex to outsiders, but were understood implicitly by group members. Those who participated in the hunt received portions, but so did those who hadn't. The elderly, the very young, anyone who had contributed to the group's survival in other ways. Sharing wasn't purely altruistic, it was practical. Today's successful hunter might be tomorrow's injured person needing care. The child who received food freely would grow into an adult who contributed. The elderly person who could no longer hunt actively still held valuable knowledge about where to hunt, when conditions were favorable, which animals were most vulnerable. The web of reciprocity extended beyond food. Someone skilled at tool making might spend extra time creating implements for others. Someone with patience for tending fire ensured it stayed alive through the night. Someone with keen eyesight and attention noticed when resources were running low before they became critically scarce. Someone good with children supervised the youngest while others worked. These weren't assigned roles in a formal sense, but patterns that emerged from individual abilities and inclinations, reinforced by the group's implicit appreciation of useful contributions. Communication within the group was constant, but not always verbal. Much was conveyed through gesture, expression, and tone. A particular sound might signal caution. A gesture might indicate direction or distance. Facial expressions communicated approval, concern, amusement, frustration. Language, when used, was practical and immediate, coordinating action, sharing information about resource locations, settling minor disputes, making plans. There was likely storytelling as well, but that belonged more to evening hours and rest periods than to the active parts of the day. The structure of an ordinary day emerged from the interaction between human needs and environmental conditions. Morning began with waking, which happened gradually as light increased and people naturally roused from sleep. There was no alarm, no predetermined schedule, just the body's response to light and the stirring of others nearby. First actions were often checking the fire. Were the coals still warm? Did they need fuel to become flames again? Had rain dampened them overnight? Then came attention to immediate physical needs, relieving bladder and bowels in designated areas away from sleeping and eating spaces, drinking water, perhaps eating something small if food was readily available. The morning assessment involved looking at weather, at the condition of the group members, at what resources were needed most urgently. If water was low, that became the priority. If food stores were depleted, gathering would be necessary. If tools had broken the previous day, time would be allocated for repair or replacement. If everyone was fed, watered, and comfortable, the day might proceed more leisurely, with time for maintenance tasks, for teaching children, for improving the living space. Movement through the day followed a rhythm that balanced activity with rest. The coolest part of morning might be used for active work, gathering, hunting, traveling to new areas. As the day warmed, particularly in hot climates, activity might slow. People might rest in shade, work on tasks that didn't require much physical exertion, or simply wait for temperatures to become more comfortable. This wasn't laziness, but practical energy management. Working through peak heat meant sweating away water that would need to be replaced, burning calories that might be scarce, risking heat exhaustion that could be dangerous. Food preparation often happened in stages throughout the day rather than in distinct meals. Someone returning from gathering might process some of what they collected immediately, sharing it with whoever was nearby. Cooked food might be prepared when fire was already burning for warmth, taking advantage of the heat. Dried meat or preserved foods might be eaten as needed whenever hunger prompted. The concept of specific meal times was less relevant when food availability varied day to day, and when the group's size meant someone was almost always doing something food-related. The repetitive nature of daily tasks created a meditative quality to much of life. Grinding seeds into meal was repetitive motion. Push, pull, push, pull. The sound constant, the muscles falling into rhythm, the mind free to wander. Weaving plant fibers into cord was similarly rhythmic. Twist, overlap, twist, overlap, hands working while attention drifted. Even walking became a kind of moving meditation, the same motion repeated thousands of times, the body on familiar paths, the mind noticing but not straining. This repetition created efficiency through muscle memory. Tasks that seemed complex initially became automatic with practice. Hands learned how much pressure to apply when shaping stone, when to increase force, and when to finesse. Eyes learned what to scan for when searching for edible plants, which colors and shapes stood out against the background. Ears learned to distinguish normal sounds of the environment from unusual ones that warranted attention. The body became an instrument finely tuned to the requirements of daily survival. Rest was not scheduled, but taken as needed and as possible. Someone tired from walking might sit down until energy returned. Someone working on a tedious task might pause to stretch, to look around, to rest eyes and hands before continuing. Midday heat often prompted collective rest, with multiple people settling into shade, some sleeping, some talking quietly, some just sitting still. This rest was unstructured and natural, the body asserting its needs without guilt or rush. The afternoon might bring a return to activity as temperatures dropped. Unfinished tasks from the morning could be completed. New priorities might have emerged. Perhaps someone found an abundant food source that warranted additional collection efforts, or a tool broke and needed immediate replacement. The group remained flexible, responding to circumstances rather than adhering to predetermined plans. As evening approached, activity generally declined. People returned to the camp area if they'd been traveling. The fire might be built up slightly for cooking and warmth as night temperatures dropped. Food preparation for the evening happened. Whatever needed cooking was arranged in or near the fire. Portions were distributed. People ate at their own pace. The tone shifted toward quieter activity, toward gathering together, toward the social aspects of group life rather than the productive ones. Darkness brought natural limits to activity. Fine detail work became impossible without good light, and fire could only illuminate a small area. Travel became dangerous without the ability to see the ground clearly. So nighttime was for rest, for storytelling, for maintenance of social bonds. People sat near the fire, close enough for warmth, but not so close as to be uncomfortable. They talked about the day, about plans for tomorrow, about nothing in particular. They told stories, some practical, recounting where food was found or what animal signs were spotted, some entertaining, embellished retellings of past events or pure fiction meant to amuse. Children listened to these evening conversations, absorbing information without formal lessons. They learned which areas were productive for gathering, which were dangerous, which were worth revisiting. They learned the names and relationships of group members from previous generations. They learned about seasonal patterns, about what to expect as time progressed. The stories served as oral history, as educational tool, as entertainment, and as bonding experience all at once. Sleep came gradually as people settled into their sleeping areas. These might be simple arrangements, hides or woven mats on the ground, perhaps some padding of grass or leaves for comfort, positioned to take advantage of residual fire warmth or natural shelter. People slept close together for warmth and security, the physical presence of others, both comforting and practical. Someone usually maintained enough awareness to tend the fire if needed during the night, adding fuel to keep coals alive without letting flames grow large enough to be dangerous. The quality of sleep was probably quite different from modern experience. Without artificial light, the body's natural rhythms aligned closely with day and night cycles. Darkness signaled sleep. Light signaled waking. Sleep might be interrupted occasionally by cold requiring someone to adjust the fire, by a child needing attention, by unusual sounds requiring investigation. But generally, the night was for rest. The physical exhaustion of daily activity made sleep come easily, and the safety of the group meant deep rest was possible. Seasonal changes brought adjustments to daily routines, but these shifts were gradual and predictable. As the year moved toward colder periods, the group might alter its patterns in response. Food preservation became more important if edible plants would be scarce later. Preparations for winter might include gathering extra materials for shelter improvement, collecting firewood in advance, or moving to locations that offered better protection from harsh weather. The transition itself was not abrupt. Each day was only slightly different from the one before, with temperatures dropping incrementally, daylight hours shortening gradually, plant availability changing bit by bit. The group adapted in step with these changes, each small adjustment easy to accommodate. More time near the fire, more layers of clothing or hide coverings, shorter travel distances, greater reliance on stored or preserved foods. All of this emerged organically from changing conditions. Winter, in regions where it was harsh, meant a slower pace of life. Energy conservation became important when calories were harder to obtain. The group might spend more time sheltering, more time in rest, less time in active ranging. Social interaction intensified as people spent more hours in close proximity. Tool maintenance and improvement might increase, since there was time for careful work that active seasons didn't allow. Storytelling and knowledge transmission might be especially rich during these periods when darkness came early and left late. Warmer seasons brought their own rhythm. Longer days meant more time for active work. Plant foods became abundant, reducing time pressure around food acquisition. The group might range more widely, exploring areas that were inaccessible or impractical during other seasons. Clothing could be minimal, reducing time spent on garment maintenance. The overall pace might quicken, taking advantage of favorable conditions to accomplish tasks that were harder during other parts of the year. But even with seasonal variation, much of life maintained a consistent core pattern. Daily needs remained the same, regardless of weather. Water, food, warmth, rest. Tools still required maintenance. Social relationships still needed tending. Children still needed supervision and teaching. The elderly still needed care and still offered guidance. The fundamental structure of group life persisted through all environmental changes, providing stability even as specific activities shifted. Within this framework, small joys emerged from simple successes. A gathering expedition that yielded more than expected meant abundant food and reduced pressure for the next day. A tool that worked particularly well made tasks easier and faster. A child mastering a new skill meant one more capable person in the group. Good weather on a day when travel was necessary made the journey pleasant rather than miserable. These weren't dramatic celebrations, but quiet satisfactions, the small accumulations of positive experience that made life feel worthwhile. Laughter would have been a regular part of life, the humor that emerges from shared experience, from mishaps and mistakes, from the playfulness that humans seem to naturally express when basic needs are met and Danger isn't immediate. Someone might trip while carrying water and get soaked, prompting laughter from others and eventually from themselves. Children playing might create games with rules that made no sense to adults, but generated great amusement. Someone might tell a story with exaggerated gestures and voices, entertaining the audience. These moments of levity provided emotional respite from the serious work of survival, reinforcing bonds and making the group more resilient. The concept of happiness in such a life was probably quite different from modern definitions. There was no pursuit of novelty, no accumulation of possessions, no climbing of social hierarchies toward distant goals. Instead, happiness might have come from steadiness, from knowing that today was similar to yesterday, and tomorrow would likely be similar to today, from belonging to a group that knew you and needed you, from competence at essential skills, from the physical satisfaction of a body doing what it was designed to do, from enough food, enough warmth, enough safety, enough connection. Suffering certainly existed in these lives, but much of it was immediate and concrete rather than abstract. Hunger when food was scarce, cold when warmth was insufficient, pain from injury or illness, grief when group members died. These were real hardships, not to be minimized, but they were also hardships that the entire group experienced together, shared burdens that didn't single out individuals as failures. If food was scarce, everyone was hungry. If someone was injured, everyone adjusted to support them. The collective nature of life meant suffering was rarely endured alone. As individuals moved through young adulthood into the middle years of life, their role in the group stabilized. Physical capabilities peaked and then very gradually began to decline, so subtly that the change was barely noticeable year to year. Someone in their 30s or 40s was probably at their most productive, experienced enough to be highly competent, still strong enough to do demanding physical work, mature enough to coordinate group activities effectively. These were the people who often carried the heaviest loads, literally and figuratively, doing the most strenuous gathering, participating in the most demanding hunts, carrying children when needed, making the most complex tools. But even at peak productivity, life remained a repetition of familiar patterns. The same gathering routes walked dozens or hundreds of times, the same tool-making techniques applied over and over, the same coordination with the same people day after day. This repetition could be seen as monotonous from an outside perspective, but from within it might have felt more like mastery. The deep knowledge that comes from doing something so many times that every detail is familiar, every variation anticipated, every problem met with practiced solutions. The progression into older age was gradual and generally dignified within the group context. Physical strength declined slowly, making certain tasks more difficult, but not impossible. Someone who could once easily carry heavy loads might need to carry lighter ones, or to take breaks more frequently, or to accept help from younger group members. But capability didn't disappear suddenly. It faded incrementally over years, and as physical ability changed, other contributions became more prominent. Older individuals became repositories of the group's accumulated knowledge. They had lived through more seasonal cycles, experienced more variations in weather and resource availability, dealt with more problems and emergencies. They remembered what had worked in the past and what hadn't. When the group faced decisions about where to go or what to do, older members could offer perspective based on decades of experience. Their memory extended back further than anyone else's, providing continuity across generations. Teaching was another natural role for aging group members. They had the patience and experience to guide children and young adults through skill development. They could demonstrate techniques slowly and clearly, having refined their own methods over years of practice. They noticed details that younger people might miss and could point out subtle aspects of tool making, plant identification, or animal behavior that made the difference between mediocre and excellent results. Older people also served as observers and advisors during times when younger adults were busy with active work. While others gathered or hunted, an elderly person might watch children, ensuring they stayed safe and resolving minor conflicts. They might tend the fire consistently, maintaining it without needing to interrupt other tasks. They might notice changes in weather patterns or animal behavior that warranted attention, alerting the group to opportunities or risks. The group's treatment of aging members reflected practical wisdom. As long as someone could contribute something, knowledge, childcare, fire tending, observation, even just emotional presence, they remained valued. The group didn't abandon people simply because they slowed down, because caring for the elderly meant that future elderly, currently young, could expect care in return. It was an investment in the group's own future stability, a demonstration that belonging wasn't conditional on peak productivity. Eventually, age would progress to a point where someone needed more care than they could provide. Walking became too difficult for long distances. Vision or hearing deteriorated enough to limit certain activities. Teeth wore down, making some foods hard to chew. Chronic pain from old injuries might increase. The group accommodated these changes within reason, shortening travel distances, providing softer foods, helping with tasks that were once independent, allowing more time for rest. The final stage of life, when it came, was simply an extension of this gradual decline. Someone might spend more and more time resting, less and less time active. Appetite might diminish as the body's needs decreased. Energy might fade until even sitting up became tiring. The group continued to provide care, water offered regularly, food prepared in easy-to-eat forms, warmth maintained, presence given. There was no medical intervention to extend life artificially, no institutional care to prolong the inevitable. Death, when it arrived, was part of the natural cycle. The group's response to death was probably a mixture of grief and acceptance. Grief because the person had been known intimately, their absence would be felt, their knowledge and presence would be missed. Acceptance because death was understood as inevitable, as part of the pattern that governed all living things. The body would be handled in whatever way the group's customs dictated, perhaps burial, perhaps left in a designated area, perhaps some other method. And life would continue. The routines would resume because they had to. Water still needed to be gathered. Food still needed to be obtained. Fire still needed tending. The group was smaller by one, but still functioned. Others would gradually fill the gaps left by the deceased person's contributions. Children who had learned from them would apply that knowledge. The stories the person had told might be retold, keeping their memory alive in oral tradition. But the fundamental rhythm of daily life would continue essentially unchanged, because that rhythm existed beyond any individual life. This continuity was perhaps the most profound aspect of such an existence. The understanding that individual lives were brief moments within a much longer story. Each person's daily routine connected them to the same basic activities that their ancestors had performed and that their descendants would perform. The specific details changed, different landscapes, different plants, different animals, but the pattern remained constant. Wake, tend fire, obtain food and water, work on necessary tasks, rest, sleep, repeat. Generation after generation, the cycle continued. From a modern perspective, such a life might seem limited or restrictive. The same activities every day, the same small group of people, the same landscape year after year. No books to read, no movies to watch, no new places to visit, no career advancement to pursue. But this judgment imposes modern values onto a completely different context. The people living these lives had no concept of alternatives, no awareness that life could be organized differently. This was simply what life was, not a limitation, but reality itself. And within that reality, there were complexities and satisfactions that might not be immediately obvious. The deep knowledge of a specific landscape created an intimacy with place that few modern people experience. Knowing every water source, every productive gathering area, every change in terrain, and vegetation across seasons, this was a rich, detailed relationship with the environment. The stability of the group meant relationships could develop depth that's harder to achieve when people move frequently or interact briefly. Knowing the same people your entire life, seeing them daily, working together on shared survival, this created bonds built on thousands of interactions and shared experiences. The absence of novelty might actually have been restful rather than boring. No need to constantly learn new skills or adapt to changing circumstances. Once you mastered the essential abilities, they remained relevant for life. Once you understood the landscape and the seasons, that knowledge stayed useful. There was security in predictability, comfort in knowing what to expect, satisfaction in competence at important tasks. Physical capabilities were probably at their fullest expression in such a lifestyle. The human body evolved to walk long distances, to lift and carry, to squat and bend and reach. Modern sedentary life uses only a fraction of what the body can do, leading to weakness and dysfunction. Early humans used their bodies constantly and completely, developing strength, endurance, flexibility, and coordination through daily activity. The satisfaction of a body working well, of physical challenges met successfully, of exhaustion earned through useful labor, these would have been regular experiences. The sensory experience of life was also fundamentally different without artificial sounds, lights, and smells. Hearing was attuned to natural sounds, wind, water, animal calls, human voices. Sight was adjusted to natural light, the full spectrum from bright sun to moonlight to darkness. Smell was sensitive to smoke, vegetation, weather changes, food, other people. Touch was direct and constant, the ground underfoot, the texture of tools, the temperature of air, the presence of others. The modern sensory overload of traffic noise, fluorescent lights, chemical odors, and constant screen time would have been incomprehensible. The mind, too, functioned differently without constant information input. There were no headlines to process, no social media feeds to scroll, no emails requiring response. Thoughts could arise and develop at their own pace. Attention could rest on one thing for extended periods without interruption. The mental space that modern people fill with consumption of content, reading, watching, listening, would instead have been filled with observation, conversation, memory, and imagination. The quality of thought might have been less fragmented, more sustained, more focused on immediate experience rather than abstract information. Sleep, particularly, would have been quite different. With activity levels high, bodies were naturally tired by evening. With darkness complete and unavoidable, there was no reason to resist sleep or stay awake artificially. With no caffeine or stimulants, no screens or bright lights. Disrupting circadian rhythms, sleep could follow natural patterns. Multiple sleep cycles through the night, possibly with periods of quiet wakefulness between them, all aligning with the body's intrinsic rhythms rather than fighting against them. The dreams of people living such lives are impossible to know, but they were probably populated by familiar elements, the people of the group, the landscape, the animals, the tasks of daily life. Perhaps anxieties about food scarcity or group conflicts played out in dreams. Perhaps wishes for successful hunts or good weather found expression. Perhaps the imagination created variations on familiar themes, recombining elements of waking experience into novel but recognizable patterns. Morning would arrive again, as it always did, with increasing light and the stirring of birds or other animals. The fire might have died to coals during the night, requiring attention. Someone would need to urinate urgently after a night's sleep. Water would need to be drunk to rehydrate. Food might be prepared or eaten from what remained from the previous evening, and the day would begin again. Another cycle, another repetition of the familiar pattern. This rhythm extended across weeks, months, years, decades, the accumulation of ordinary days that made up an entire life. No single day particularly remarkable, but the sum of them constituting existence. Modern people often think of life in terms of highlights and achievements, memorable moments and significant events, but actually, most of any human life, even modern ones, consists of ordinary days, getting up, doing necessary tasks, interacting with familiar people, going to sleep. The ratio of mundane to memorable is probably similar across all human experience. What changes is the variety of mundane activities and the nature of memorable events. For early humans in small groups, the memorable events might have been births and deaths, serious injuries or illnesses, conflicts within the group or with other groups, exceptional weather events, unusually successful or unsuccessful periods for food acquisition. But these were rare punctuations in the steady flow of normal days. Most days featured the same basic structure, the same general activities, the same familiar faces, the same trusted landscape. This repetition created a kind of stability that modern life rarely offers. Certainty about what each day would basically entail. Confidence in one's ability to meet daily challenges. Security in knowing that the group would continue functioning according to familiar patterns. Changes happened slowly enough to be absorbed without disruption. Even major events like birth or death didn't fundamentally alter the basic rhythm of daily life for the group as a whole. From this perspective, an average day in such a life was not an adventure or a challenge to be conquered, but simply a day, another turning of the cycle, another opportunity to do what needed doing, another occasion to be with familiar people in a familiar place. The value of the day didn't come from its uniqueness, but from its participation in the larger pattern. Just as one breath is valuable, not because it's different from other breaths, but because it sustains life. One day was valuable because it sustained the group and connected the past to the future. As we consider this way of life from our modern vantage point, it offers a strange kind of comfort. The pressures that dominate contemporary existence, the need to achieve, to stand out, to accumulate, to progress, were largely absent. Instead, there was simply the need to persist, to maintain, to continue. Success was not measured by surpassing others or reaching new heights, but by successfully repeating the proven patterns that kept everyone fed, warm, and together. This is not to romanticize early human life, or to suggest it was somehow better than modern existence. The hardships were real, the dangers genuine, the losses painful. Medical knowledge was minimal, meaning injuries and illnesses that would be treatable today could be fatal then. Child mortality was probably high. Life expectancy was shorter. The margin for error was thin. A serious drought, a harsh winter, a conflict with another group, any of these could threaten the group's survival. But within those constraints, people found ways to live that were meaningful to them. They created cultures, developed technologies, formed relationships, raised children, cared for each other, and found moments of joy and satisfaction. They adapted to their environments and generally succeeded at the basic task of survival, as evidenced by the fact that their descendants eventually populated the entire world. The lessons from this kind of existence are not that we should return to it. That's neither possible nor desirable, but that we might reconsider what's essential for human well-being. The complexity of modern life sometimes obscures the simple fact that humans need relatively little to survive: food, water, warmth, safety, and social connection. Everything else is elaboration, variation on these themes. An early human's day organized around obtaining these essentials demonstrates that life can be full and meaningful even when simple, that satisfaction can come from competence rather than novelty, that belonging matters more than status. As this long consideration of an ordinary day comes to a close, the invitation is to borrow something from that ancient rhythm. Not the specific activities, obviously. Most of us will not be gathering roots or tending fires tomorrow, but the underlying pattern, the acceptance of routine, the value of simple competence, the comfort of familiar people and places, the satisfaction of needs met, the rest that comes from useful exhaustion, the sleep that follows naturally when the day is done. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you might notice your own basic rhythms, the breath moving in and out, requiring no conscious effort, just continuing steadily like a small fire that tends itself, the body settling into stillness after the day's activities, whatever those were, finding its preferred position for rest, the mind beginning to release its hold on the day's thoughts, letting them drift away, like smoke dissipating into darkness. You are safe in this moment, as safe as any early human beside their carefully tended fire. The group around you may be different, separated by walls and distance rather than gathered in proximity, but the human need for rest is the same. Your breath can be your fire tonight, small and steady, requiring only the gentlest attention. Inhale, like adding fuel. Exhale, like releasing smoke. The cycle continues on its own, reliable and rhythmic, asking nothing of you except permission to continue. The thoughts of the day can fade now, the way evening light fades into dusk and then into dark. There is no need to hold on to them, no benefit to reviewing. order them again. They have served their purpose and can be released. What remains is simply this: breathing, resting, being held by darkness and stillness, moving gently towards sleep like someone who has walked a long, familiar path and finally arrived home. The ordinary day, whether lived 10,000 years ago or tonight, ends the same way, with rest, with release, with the body and mind settling into the peace of completion. Nothing dramatic needs to happen. No problem needs to be solved. The day is finished, and that finishing itself is enough. Sleep can come now, soft and natural, like water finding its level, like weight settling, like fire dying to gentle coals that will warm you through the night. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The woolly mammoth lived in a world shaped by ice and cold, a world where survival wasn't about dramatic moments, but about the steady accumulation of small adaptations, behaviors, and knowledge passed down through generations. To understand what life was like for these enormous creatures, we need to first understand the landscape they inhabited, not as a backdrop, but as the fundamental context that shaped every aspect of their existence. The Ice Age tundra stretched across vast expanses of the northern hemisphere, creating an ecosystem unlike anything we see today. This wasn't a frozen wasteland devoid of life, but rather a complex environment that supported a surprising diversity of plants and animals. The landscape was predominantly open, with low-growing vegetation that could withstand extreme cold and harsh winds. Grasses, sedges, and hardy shrubs formed a carpet across the ground, interspersed with patches of moss and lichen that clung to rocks and spread across the soil. The openness of this terrain meant that sight lines extended for great distances, allowing animals to see approaching weather systems, potential threats, or other members of their species from far away. The cold itself was a constant presence, but not in the way we might imagine. Rather than dangerous temperature swings or sudden freezes, the Ice Age climate in many regions was characterized by a persistent, steady cold that varied with the seasons but remained within a range that the local life forms had adapted to over thousands of generations. This consistency, in its own way, was easier to manage than unpredictability. Bodies could evolve specific adaptations, behaviors could be refined, and the fundamental challenge became not avoiding the cold, but living productively within it. When a mammoth calf was born into this world, the experience began not with sight or sound, but with temperature and touch. The newborn emerged into air that would feel shockingly cold to us. But the calf's first moments were cushioned by the immediate presence of the mother's body and the surrounding herd members. Adult mammoths would position themselves around the birth site, creating a living windbreak that reduced the chill and provided a zone of relative warmth. The calf's wet skin needed to dry quickly to prevent dangerous heat loss, and the mother would use her trunk to help clear fluids and stimulate the newborn's circulation. Within the first hour of life, the calf would attempt to stand, a process that involved multiple attempts, wobbly legs, and persistent effort. The drive to stand came from deep instinct, because a mammoth that couldn't stand couldn't nurse, couldn't walk with the herd, and couldn't survive. The calf's legs, though seemingly too long and unstable for the body they supported, were already equipped with the basic structure they would need for a lifetime of walking. The joints, tendons, and muscles just needed to learn how to coordinate, how to respond to the brain's commands, and how to maintain balance on uneven ground. The first successful standing was followed quickly by the search for milk. The mother's mammary glands were located between her front legs, positioned so that the calf could nurse while both animals stood. This arrangement allowed for feeding even while the herd was moving slowly, an important adaptation for animals whose survival often depended on continuous, gradual migration. The milk itself was rich in fat and nutrients, providing not just calories, but also the building blocks for rapid growth and, critically, for developing the insulating layers of fat that would become essential for cold tolerance. During these earliest days and weeks, the calf's world was defined almost entirely by proximity. The herd moved as a cohesive unit, with calves remaining close to their mothers and surrounded by other adults who functioned as aunts, sisters, and protective guardians. This social structure wasn't just about protection from predators. It was about heat management, learning, and the transmission of knowledge. Young calves could observe how adults selected feeding sites, how they used their trunks to manipulate vegetation, how they responded to changes in weather, and where they chose to rest during different parts of the day. The mammoth's trunk deserves particular attention, because it was perhaps the most remarkable tool in the animal kingdom, a fusion of nose and upper lip that had evolved into an appendage of extraordinary sensitivity and versatility. For a young calf, learning to use the trunk was a gradual process that occupied much of the first year of life. Initially, the trunk seemed almost to get in the way, flopping about without much purpose while the calf nursed and walked. But through trial and error, through observation of adults, and through the simple passage of time, allowing neural pathways to mature, the calf began to discover what the trunk could do. The trunk contained no bones, but was instead composed of an intricate network of muscles, approximately 40,000 individual muscle units working in coordination. This gave it an almost infinite range of motion and a delicacy of control that allowed mammoths to pluck a single blade of grass or lift a heavy log with equal ease. The tip of the trunk featured finger-like projections that could grasp and manipulate objects with surprising precision. For a young mammoth, the trunk became a tool for exploring the world, touching ice to understand its temperature and texture, feeling the wind to gauge its strength and direction, investigating new plants to assess their edibility, and maintaining physical contact with herd members for reassurance and social bonding. Feeding, once the calf began to supplement nursing with vegetation, became the dominant activity of daily life. Mammoths were herbivores with enormous caloric needs. An adult could consume upward of 300 pounds of plant material in a single day during the growing season. This meant that feeding wasn't a discrete event that happened at specific times, but rather an ongoing process that occupied most of the daylight hours and continued, to some extent, even at night. The herd would move slowly across the landscape, each individual grazing as they went, creating a pattern of movement that was measured in miles per day rather than miles per hour. The types of plants that mammoths ate varied with the season and location, but the foundation of their diet consisted of grasses, sedges, and other herbaceous plants that grew low to the ground. These plants weren't particularly nutritious on a per-bite basis, which meant that mammoths had to process enormous volumes to meet their energy needs. Their teeth were specially adapted for this task. Large, ridged molars that worked like grinding plates to break down tough, fibrous plant material. Unlike human teeth, which are permanent once the adult set comes in, mammoths had a conveyor belt system of tooth replacement. New molars would form at the back of the jaw and gradually move forward as the front teeth wore down and were eventually shed. Over a lifetime, a mammoth would go through 6 sets of molars, with the final set needing to last through old age. The physical mechanics of eating involved more than just the mouth and teeth. The trunk pulled up grasses and other plants, sometimes in large clumps if the vegetation was dense, other times selecting individual plants with care. The trunk would transfer this material to the mouth, where the tongue and cheek muscles worked with the grinding teeth to begin the digestive process. Like modern elephants, mammoths were not particularly efficient digesters. Much of what they ate passed through their system without being fully broken down. This inefficiency was compensated for by sheer volume. They simply ate vast quantities, extracting enough nutrition to fuel their massive bodies through the portion they could digest. As the seasons changed, so did the herd's feeding strategies and locations. During the warmer months, when sunlight lasted longer and stimulated plant growth, the tundra became relatively lush. This was the time of plenty, when mammoths could afford to be somewhat selective about what they ate, choosing the most nutritious plants and leaving the tougher, less palatable options. The herd would spread out more during these months, with individuals sometimes grazing several body lengths apart, loosening the tight formation that characterized colder times. Calves had more freedom to explore during this season, wandering farther from their mothers while still remaining within the general safety zone created by the herd's presence. This looser formation during good weather served multiple purposes. It reduced competition for the best feeding spots, allowed individuals to follow their own preferences and needs, and gave younger animals space to practice the skills they would need as adults. However, even during these dispersed periods, the herd maintained awareness of each member's location through vocalizations, scent, and visual contact. Mammoths could produce a range of sounds, from low-frequency rumbles that could travel for miles across open terrain to higher-pitched calls used for closer communication. These sounds helped coordinate movement, signal alarm, or simply maintain the social bonds that held the group together. When winter arrived, the transformation of both landscape and herd behavior was gradual but profound. The first changes were subtle: cooler nights, shorter days, and a slowing in the rate of plant growth. As autumn progressed, the available vegetation became less abundant and less nutritious, having completed its growing cycle and begun to dry and wither. Mammoths responded by adjusting their feeding patterns, spending more time seeking out the plants that retained the most food value, and beginning to use their trunks and feet to access vegetation that was becoming buried under the season's first snows. Snow changed the landscape in ways both obvious and subtle. The visual transformation was dramatic, as the varied browns, greens, and grays of the tundra became covered in white. But the more significant impact was on access to food. Snow, even relatively shallow accumulations, could hide the low-growing plants that formed the bulk of the mammoth diet. Mammoths dealt with this challenge through a combination of techniques that likely varied by individual preference and local conditions. They could use their trunks to sweep snow aside, revealing the vegetation underneath. They could use their feet to paw through snow, much like modern horses and bison do when seeking winter forage. And they possessed the ability to sense, perhaps through smell or through subtle visual cues, where the best feeding opportunities lay beneath the snow cover. The cold of winter, while persistent, was something mammoths were supremely well adapted to handle. Their most visible adaptation was their coat, which actually consisted of two distinct layers. The outer layer featured long guard hairs that could reach lengths of 3 feet or more, creating a shaggy appearance that helped define the mammoth's iconic silhouette. These guard hairs were relatively coarse and served primarily to shed snow and water, keeping the inner coat dry. Beneath the guard hairs lay a much denser layer of fine, soft fur that provided the actual insulation. This underfur was so densely packed that it created an effective barrier against heat loss, trapping warm air close to the skin and preventing the cold air from penetrating to the body's surface. But the coat was only one element of the mammoth's cold adaptation. Equally important was the layer of fat that mammoths accumulated beneath their skin, particularly during the late summer and autumn when food was most abundant. This subcutaneous fat served multiple functions. It provided additional insulation. It stored energy that could be metabolized during the leaner winter months, and it gave the mammoth's body a more rounded, less angular profile that minimized surface area relative to volume, thereby reducing heat loss. On the mammoth's upper back, this fat could accumulate into a pronounced hump, creating a reserve of energy that the animal could draw upon when food became scarce, or when the energy costs of staying warm exceeded what could be obtained from daily feeding. The mammoth's ears and tail also showed clear adaptations to cold weather. Unlike the large, fan-like ears of modern African elephants, which served to dissipate excess heat in hot climates, mammoth ears were relatively small and covered in fur. This reduced surface area meant less heat loss from these extremities. Similarly, the tail was much shorter than that of tropical elephants, again minimizing the body parts exposed to cold air. Even the trunk, which couldn't be shortened without losing functionality, had adaptations in the form of specialized oil glands that kept the skin from cracking in the dry, cold air. As winter deepened and the herd tightened its formation, the social dynamics of mammoth life became even more important. Bodies positioned closer together provided mutual warmth, with calves often standing directly beneath larger adults to take advantage of the heat radiating from those massive bodies. The herd's movement became more deliberate during this season, with less wandering and more focused travel along routes that led to known feeding areas or sheltered valleys where the wind was less fierce. These routes represented accumulated knowledge, not written or spoken, but encoded in memory and behavior, passed from older animals to younger ones through observation and repetition. Migration, for mammoths, wasn't a single annual journey from one place to another, in the manner of some bird species. Instead, it was a more fluid pattern of movement that responded to the changing availability of resources throughout the year. In general terms, mammoths tended to move to higher, more exposed areas during the warmer months when these locations offered fresh plant growth and fewer biting insects, then gradually shift to lower, more sheltered terrain as winter approached. But the exact routes, timing, and destinations varied based on local conditions, weather patterns in a given year, and the specific knowledge held by the herd's more experienced members. The concept of the herd following ancient paths is more than poetic imagery. It reflects a real aspect of how memory and learning function in long-lived social animals. Adult mammoths who had lived for decades carried mental maps of vast territories, knowing where water could be found even in dry years, where certain valleys offered protection from prevailing winds, where river crossings became feasible as water levels changed, and which routes avoided the most treacherous terrain. This knowledge wasn't instinctive in the sense of being genetically hardwired. Rather, it was learned through experience and observation, making each older mammoth a repository of survival information crucial to the herd's success. The actual mechanics of migration were unspectacular by human standards, but perfectly suited to mammoth biology. The herd would move at a steady walking pace, typically covering somewhere between 5 and 15 miles in a day, though this varied considerably based on terrain, weather, and the need to spend time feeding. The pace was slow enough that calves could keep up without exhausting themselves, and adults could feed as they traveled, plucking vegetation along the route. This gradual movement created minimal stress on individual animals and allowed the herd to remain cohesive rather than becoming strung out over long distances. During migration, the herd's social structure became particularly visible. Experienced adult females typically led the way, not through any dramatic decision-making process, but simply by starting to move in a particular direction and having others follow. Young calves stayed close to their mothers, learning the routes through sheer repetition and observation. Adolescents occupied intermediate positions, old enough to not require constant supervision, but young enough to still benefit from proximity to adults. Older males, if present with the herd, often took up positions at the periphery, where they could serve as early warning systems for potential threats, while also having the freedom to move somewhat independently. The threats that mammoths faced varied by location and time period, but generally came from two main sources: predators and environmental hazards. Among predators, the primary concerns were large carnivores like cave lions, saber-toothed cats, and wolf packs. However, adult mammoths, due to their enormous size, thick hide, and defensive capabilities with their tusks, were largely immune to predation. The real targets were calves, sick or injured individuals, and occasionally elderly mammoths whose strength had declined. The herd's defensive response to predator presence was characterized by calm competence rather than panic. Adults would position themselves between the threat and vulnerable herd members, presenting an intimidating wall of massive bodies, long tusks, and potentially aggressive charges if the predator pressed too close. Environmental hazards could be equally challenging. Rivers swollen with seasonal runoff had to be crossed at points where the current wasn't too strong and the bottom wasn't too soft. Deep snow could make travel exhausting, forcing the herd to break trail through drifts that came up to their bellies. Sudden weather changes, while rare in the relatively stable Ice Age climate, could occasionally bring conditions that required the herd to seek immediate shelter or hunker down in place until the worst passed. Ice presented its own dangers, particularly in the form of frozen lakes or rivers where the ice might appear solid but could give way under a mammoth's weight, potentially trapping an individual in frigid water where survival time was measured in minutes. Through all these challenges, the mammoth's behavioral response remained remarkably consistent: measured assessment, collective action, and an apparent absence of the kind of panic that would waste energy and potentially scatter the herd. This calmness wasn't a conscious philosophical choice, but rather an evolved behavioral pattern that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years. Individuals that panicked or made rash decisions were less likely to survive and reproduce, while those that maintained composure and followed established patterns were more likely to pass their genes and their behavioral tendencies to the next generation. As a young mammoth matured through its first several years, the rate of learning was remarkably high. By the age of 2 or 3, a calf had learned the basic geography of the herd's range, recognized the seasonal patterns of movement and feeding, and understood the fundamental social rules that governed interactions between herd members. These rules were rarely, if ever, enforced through violence. Instead, they operated through a system of gentle corrections, spatial positioning, and the subtle communication of expectations. A young mammoth that tried to feed in a spot where a higher-ranking individual was grazing would be deterred by nothing more than the adult's presence, and perhaps a slight shift of position or a soft vocalization. Physical confrontations, when they occurred at all, were typically limited to pushing matches between individuals of similar status and age, serving more to establish relative positions in the social hierarchy than to inflict actual harm. The spacing between individuals during feeding time reflected this social structure. Higher-ranking mammoths, typically older females, with calves, got first choice of the best feeding spots. Younger adults and adolescents took what was available, moving to new areas if the preferred spots were occupied. This system of priority access wasn't rigid. Circumstances could alter the normal hierarchy, and individual relationships within the herd created variations in the general pattern. But the overall effect was to minimize conflict and ensure that the most vulnerable and most important individuals, pregnant females and those with young calves, had adequate nutrition. By the time a mammoth reached adolescence, somewhere around age 8 to 12, its body had grown substantially, but hadn't yet reached full adult size. This intermediate phase was characterized by continued physical development, increasing independence, and particularly for males, the beginning of a gradual separation from the maternal herd. Female mammoths typically remained with their birth herd for life, becoming integrated into the social fabric and eventually raising their own calves within that familiar context. Males, however, faced a different trajectory. As they approached sexual maturity, they became increasingly peripheral to the herd, spending more time on the edges of the group and eventually drifting away to become solitary or to join loosely associated groups of other males. This dispersal of males served an important genetic function by reducing the likelihood of inbreeding and promoting genetic diversity across the population. Young males leaving their birth herd would encounter females from other herds during the breeding season, introducing new genetic combinations into those populations. The timing and completeness of male dispersal varied. Some left relatively early and completely, while others maintained loose associations with their birth herd for extended periods. The key point is that this separation was gradual and relatively peaceful, driven more by changing social dynamics and hormonal influences than by any dramatic expulsion. For females remaining with the herd, the transition to adulthood brought different changes. Physical maturity arrived at around age 10 to 15, at which point a female could conceive her first calf. However, successful reproduction required more than just physical capability. It also required adequate body condition, meaning sufficient fat reserves to support the enormous energetic costs of pregnancy and lactation. In lean years, even physically mature females might not reproduce, their bodies instead prioritizing survival over reproduction. This flexible reproductive strategy helped mammoth populations persist through variable environmental conditions, ramping up reproduction when resources were abundant and scaling it back during harder times. Pregnancy in mammoths lasted approximately 22 months, nearly 2 years from conception to birth. This extraordinarily long gestation period was necessary to produce a calf that was sufficiently developed to survive the harsh conditions it would face immediately upon birth. A newborn mammoth weighed around 200 pounds and stood roughly 3 feet tall at the shoulder, already a substantial animal by most standards, though small compared to its mother. The long pregnancy also meant that female mammoths could produce, at most, 1 calf every 3 to 4 years, even under ideal conditions. Combined with the long period of juvenile dependence, during which calves relied on their mothers for protection, guidance, and nutrition. This meant that each successful reproductive event represented a significant investment of time and resources. The actual birth process, while we can't observe it directly in mammoths, can be reasonably inferred from what we know about elephant births and mammoth biology. Labor would likely have lasted several hours, with the herd remaining in a relatively protected location during this vulnerable time. The calf would be born in a protective circle of adult bodies, reducing exposure to wind and providing immediate security. The mother would use her trunk to help clear the birth membranes and stimulate the newborn to breathe and stand. Other females in the herd, particularly those with their own calves or previous reproductive experience, would remain close, ready to assist if needed, and to provide additional protection for the vulnerable newborn. The first days and weeks of a calf's life were the most dangerous, with mortality rates highest during this period. Challenges included predation, harsh weather, difficulty nursing or keeping up with the herd, and various health issues that could arise despite the mother's care. Calves that survived these initial weeks had progressively better chances of reaching adulthood as they grew larger, more capable, and more knowledgeable about their environment. By the end of the first year, a calf would have doubled or tripled its birth weight, developed a full winter coat, and become a competent walker capable of keeping pace with the herd during daily movements and seasonal migrations. The bond between mother and calf was central to the young mammoth's survival and development. This relationship extended far beyond basic care, encompassing the teaching of skills, the transmission of knowledge about the landscape and its resources, and the provision of emotional security in a challenging environment. Mammoths, like modern elephants, appear to have been capable of forming strong emotional attachments, showing behaviors that suggested grief when herd members died, maintaining long-term social relationships with specific individuals, and displaying what can only be described as affection through physical contact vocalizations, and coordinated activities. As an adult mammoth settled into the middle years of life, existence took on a quality of rhythmic repetition. Each year brought the same basic cycle: the gradual warming of spring and the expansion of feeding opportunities, the abundance of summer and the loosening of the herd structure, the cooling of autumn and the need to build fat reserves, the challenges of winter and the tightening of social bonds. Within each season, the daily pattern remained consistent: feeding, resting, moving, socializing, and maintaining the physical condition necessary to survive and potentially reproduce. The landscape itself became intimately familiar through this repetition. An adult mammoth would recognize specific features of the terrain: particular hills, distinctive rock formations, notable river bends, and favored feeding areas. These landmarks served as mental waypoints in the internal maps that guided seasonal movements. More subtly, the mammoth would develop a feel for the terrain, understanding how different types of ground affected walking, where certain soil conditions led to better plant growth, and how local topography influenced wind patterns and snow accumulation. This detailed environmental knowledge made the landscape feel less like an external space to traverse and more like a known territory to inhabit. Feeding, while it remained the primary daily activity throughout adulthood, became more efficient as animals gained experience. An adult mammoth developed preferences based on individual taste and experience, learning which plants provided the best nutrition at different times of the year, which ones could be safely ignored as offering little value, and which might be worth eating only when preferred options weren't available. The trunk's sensitivity allowed for sophisticated assessment of potential food. Texture could indicate toughness or freshness. Scent could reveal chemical composition, and even subtle variations in temperature might provide information about a plant's condition. During particularly challenging feeding conditions, such as when snow covered the ground or when summer drought had reduced plant growth, mammoths demonstrated problem-solving abilities in accessing nutrition. Archaeological evidence suggests they would use their tusks to break through ice to reach water, dig through snow and soil to access roots and tubers, and strip bark from shrubs and small trees when other food sources were scarce. These behaviors required not just physical capability, but also the cognitive ability to recognize a problem, conceive of a solution, and execute the necessary actions, a level of intelligence that places mammoths among the more cognitively sophisticated animals to have lived on Earth. The tusks themselves were remarkable structures that grew continuously throughout a mammoth's life, potentially reaching lengths of 15 feet or more in large males. These were actually enormously elongated incisor teeth, composed primarily of dentine and covered with a thin layer of enamel that wore away relatively quickly, leaving the dentine exposed. The tusks curved in complex patterns, sometimes forming spirals or other distinctive shapes, depending on how the animal used them and how they naturally grew. Beyond their practical utility in moving snow, digging, and manipulating objects, the tusks served as visual signals of age, health, and possibly status within social groups. Larger tusks required more resources to grow and maintain, so they demonstrated an individual's ability to thrive in challenging conditions. Social interactions during adulthood extended beyond the immediate concerns of feeding, migration, and reproduction. Mammoths appear to have engaged in various forms of social behavior that weren't strictly necessary for survival, but that strengthened bonds between individuals and maintained group cohesion. Physical contact was common, with herd members touching trunks in what seemed to be greeting behaviors, standing close together during rest periods, and engaging in what might be termed play among younger animals. Vocalizations served to coordinate activities, maintain contact when visibility was limited, and, potentially, to convey emotional states or intentions. The social structure of mammoth herds, based on comparisons with modern elephants and evidence from mammoth fossil sites, was almost certainly matriarchal. The oldest, most experienced females would have held the most influential positions, not through dominance in the aggressive sense, but through their accumulated knowledge, their calm presence, and the respect given by other herd members. These matriarchs would have been the repositories of crucial survival information: where to find water during dry spells, which routes were passable during different conditions, how to respond to various threats, and countless other details accumulated over decades of experience. The middle years of adulthood for females often involved not just raising their own calves, but also participating in the care of calves born to sisters, daughters, and other herd members. This alloparenting behavior helped distribute the enormous work of calf rearing among multiple individuals, improving the survival chances of all calves in the herd. A mother dealing with a difficult birth or an illness could rely on other females to help protect and even nurse her calf. This cooperative breeding system was another factor that contributed to mammoth success, as it meant that reproductive success was tied not just to individual capability, but to the strength and cohesion of the entire social group. For males living outside the female herds, life took on different rhythms. Solitary males or those in loose bachelor groups had more freedom to move independently, following their own priorities rather than coordinating with a larger group. This lifestyle had both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, a solitary male didn't have to compete for food or adjust his pace to match slower-moving calves. He could exploit resources more opportunistically, staying in one area as long as it remained productive and moving on quickly when conditions changed. On the other hand, a solitary animal lacked the protection and collective knowledge of a herd, making him potentially more vulnerable to predators and environmental hazards, and missing out on the social interactions that seemed to be important to mammoth well-being. Breeding for males involved seeking out female herds during the appropriate season, which varied by location, but generally aligned with times when food would be most abundant for pregnant and nursing females. Males approaching reproductive maturity, around age 25 to 30, would enter a physiological state called musth, characterized by heightened hormone levels, increased aggression toward other males, and strong motivation to seek out receptive females. During musth, males would travel widely, following scent cues to locate female herds and competing with other males for mating opportunities. These competitions could involve impressive displays of size and strength, with males using their tusks to spar and push against each other, though serious injuries appear to have been relatively rare, as the objective was to establish dominance rather than to kill. After successful mating, males would typically leave the female herd and return to their solitary or bachelor group existence. The entire burden of pregnancy, birth, and calf rearing fell on the females and their supporting herd structure. This reproductive strategy, while it might seem unfair by human standards, was highly effective from an evolutionary perspective. It allowed males to potentially father multiple offspring across different herds, while females could focus their energy on successfully raising the calves they produced, supported by the stable social structure of the maternal herd. The long reproductive cycle of mammoths, with multi-year pregnancies, extended periods of calf dependency, and relatively late sexual maturity, meant that population growth was necessarily slow. Mammoth populations couldn't bounce back quickly from catastrophic events the way faster reproducing species could. This characteristic would eventually contribute to their vulnerability when conditions changed rapidly at the end of the Ice Age. But during the stable conditions of the late Pleistocene, it served them well, maintaining populations at sustainable levels relative to available resources. As the Ice Age progressed through its long cycles, the environment that mammoths inhabited underwent changes operating on timescales ranging from decades to millennia. These changes were driven primarily by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, which affected how much solar radiation different parts of the planet received during different seasons. When these orbital parameters favored ice accumulation, glaciers expanded, sea levels dropped, and the climate became colder and drier. When they favored ice melting, the opposite occurred. For mammoths, these gradual climate shifts meant adjustments to migration routes, changes in the types and abundance of available vegetation, and sometimes expansion or contraction of their geographic range. The mammoth steppe ecosystem, as paleontologists call the Ice Age grassland that stretched across northern Eurasia and into North America, was itself a product of these climate conditions. Cold, dry air promoted the growth of grasses and inhibited tree growth, maintaining the open landscape that mammoths and many other large herbivores depended on. As long as these conditions persisted, the ecosystem remained relatively stable, supporting high densities of large animals whose grazing and trampling actually helped maintain the grassland character of the landscape. This was a true coevolutionary system, where the animals and the vegetation shaped each other over thousands of generations. Within this broadly stable system, shorter-term variations still occurred. Some winters were harsher than others, some summers wetter or drier, some years with more plant growth, and others with less. Mammoths navigated these variations through behavioral flexibility rather than genetic change. In years when snow depth made feeding difficult, they would spend more time in wind-swept areas where snow cover was thinner, or they would increase their use of woody browse from shrubs and trees. In years when water sources were scarce, they would adjust their migration routes to pass through areas where permanent water holes existed, or they would dig in dry stream beds to access groundwater. The presence of humans in the mammoth's world began to increase significantly around 40,000 years ago, though humans and mammoths had coexisted in some regions for much longer. For most of this period, humans were simply another element of the landscape, another predator, albeit one with unusual capabilities. Early human groups hunted mammoths opportunistically, taking advantage of individuals that had died naturally or that could be separated from the herd and killed with coordinated spear attacks. The impact of this hunting on mammoth populations was probably minimal during most of the Ice Age. as human populations were small and mammoths were abundant across vast territories. From the mammoth's perspective, humans would have been recognizable as a potential threat, but not necessarily the dominant concern they would later become. A herd that spotted a group of humans at a distance might alter course to maintain separation, or it might simply continue with its normal activities if the humans didn't appear to be approaching aggressively. The key point is that humans were part of a complex landscape that included multiple potential dangers, and mammoths had evolved behavioral strategies, vigilance, herd cohesion, protective positioning of vulnerable members that served them well against various threats without requiring specific adaptations to any single one. As individual mammoths aged beyond their prime adult years, the changes were gradual and subtle at first. A mammoth in its 40s might still appear robust and capable, but close observation would reveal slightly slower movements, longer rest periods, and a tendency to choose easier paths when the herd was traveling. The body's repair and maintenance systems, which had functioned efficiently for decades, began to work less perfectly. Injuries took longer to heal. Fat reserves became harder to maintain during winter, and the gut's ability to extract nutrition from food gradually declined. These weren't dramatic changes, but rather a slow accumulation of small decrements that collectively constituted aging. By the 50s and beyond, these changes became more pronounced. An elderly mammoth's tusks would show extensive wear, sometimes broken or damaged from decades of use. The final set of molar teeth would be wearing down, and as they did, feeding became progressively more difficult and less efficient. The coat, while still providing insulation, might appear less sleek and full, with patches of wear or damage that no longer regenerated as completely. Movement became more deliberate and cautious, with a preference for flatter terrain and a reluctance to ford rivers or climb steep slopes that would have been navigated easily in younger years. The herd's accommodation of elderly members reflected the value that mammoth society placed on experience and the bonds between individuals. Rather than abandoning animals who slowed down, the herd adjusted its pace, taking more frequent rest breaks and spending longer periods in areas with good feeding. This behavior was probably reinforced by the fact that elderly mammoths, particularly females, still carried valuable knowledge about the landscape, weather patterns, and survival strategies. A matriarch who had lived for 60 or more years had experienced every type of environmental variation the region could offer, and her calm presence and informed decision-making during crises could be crucial to the herd's survival. There likely came a point, however, when an elderly mammoth could no longer keep up with even the herd's adjusted pace, or when feeding became so difficult that maintaining body weight was impossible. As this happened, the individual would spend more time resting, gradually eating less, and slowly weakening. The end, when it came, was probably quiet, a time when the old mammoth simply lay down to rest and didn't rise again. The body's systems, strained beyond their capacity to maintain basic functions, would shut down gradually, circulation slowing, breathing becoming shallower, awareness fading into unconsciousness, and then cessation. The herd's response to death appears to have been one of recognition and what might be termed mourning. Based on observations of modern elephants and some archaeological evidence from mammoth sites, other herd members might stay with the body for a period, touching it with their trunks, making vocalizations, and showing what appeared to be reluctance to leave. Eventually, however, the practical demands of survival would require the herd to move on, leaving the body to the landscape and the scavengers that would process it back into the ecosystem. The death of a mammoth returned an enormous quantity of organic matter to the environment. The body, weighing several tons, represented years of accumulated nutrients that would now be recycled. Scavengers, from large predators to ravens to insects, would feed on the soft tissues. Bones would be scattered by animals seeking minerals. Over years and decades, even the massive bones would break down, weathered by freeze-thaw cycles, dissolved by acidic soils, and fragmented by the trampling of other large animals. In some cases, particularly when death occurred in wetlands or other preserving environments, the remains might be buried in sediment and begin the long process of fossilization, eventually becoming the mammoth bones and tusks that modern humans would discover tens of thousands of years later. For the individual mammoth, death marked the end of a life that had spanned decades of seasons, migrations, and experiences. For the species, each death and each birth was part of a continuous cycle that had persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, with mammoths appearing in the fossil record around 400,000 years ago and surviving in various forms and locations until roughly 4,000 years ago, when the last isolated populations finally disappeared. During the peak of the Ice Age, mammoths were among the most successful large mammals on the planet, with populations numbering in the millions and ranges extending across entire continents. To understand the full scale of mammoth life, we need to step back and consider the broader temporal and spatial context. The Ice Age itself was not a single period, but rather a series of glacial and interglacial cycles stretching back millions of years. Mammoths evolved during this dynamic period, developing the adaptations that allowed them to thrive in cold conditions. Different mammoth species occupied different geographic ranges and time periods. The steppe mammoth, the Columbian mammoth in North America, the woolly mammoth across the northern latitudes, and the dwarf mammoths that evolved on isolated islands. The woolly mammoth, the species we most commonly envision, was supremely adapted to the cold, dry conditions of the mammoth steppe. Its range extended from Spain in the west to North America in the east, spanning the entirety of northern Eurasia and crossing the Bering Land Bridge that connected Asia and North America during periods of low sea level. This enormous range encompassed tremendous variation in local conditions, and mammoths showed corresponding variation in their specific adaptations and behaviors. Northern populations tended to be slightly larger and more heavily furred than southern populations. Some populations migrated long distances seasonally, while others occupied more restricted ranges where resources were reliably available year-round. The mammoth steppe ecosystem was extraordinarily productive during the Ice Age, supporting not just mammoths, but also woolly rhinoceroses, bison, horses, reindeer, musk oxen, and numerous other large herbivores, along with the predators that fed on them. This high productivity was possible because of the combination of cold temperatures, relatively low snowfall in many regions, and continuous grazing prevented the establishment of forests and maintained the grassland character of the landscape. Grasses, in turn, could support high densities of large herbivores because of their ability to regrow after grazing, and their high nutritional value during the growing season. The interconnectedness of this ecosystem meant that mammoths were not isolated creatures, but rather key participants in a complex web of relationships. Their feeding patterns influenced which plants dominated different areas. Their trampling affected soil compaction and seed dispersal. Their dung provided nutrients and transport for seeds, fungi, and invertebrates. Their bodies, both living and dead, provided resources for numerous other organisms, from the parasites and symbionts that lived on and in them to the scavengers that fed on their remains. In a very real sense, mammoths helped create the world they lived in, shaping the landscape through their presence and activities. As the climate began to change at the end of the Pleistocene, around 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, the stable conditions that had supported the mammoth steppe began to break down. Temperatures rose, precipitation patterns changed, and the growing season lengthened in many areas. These shifts favored the growth of trees and shrubs over grasses, gradually transforming the open steppe into forest and wetland. For mammoths, this environmental transformation was catastrophic, though it occurred over thousands of years rather than all at once. The gradual replacement of grassland with forest meant less available food, fragmentation of populations as suitable habitat became patchier, and increasing difficulty in accessing the open spaces they required. Simultaneously, human populations were growing, becoming more technologically sophisticated, and developing more efficient hunting strategies. The combination of environmental stress and increased human pressure created a perfect storm that most mammoth populations couldn't survive. Some populations persisted longer than others, particularly in the far north, where conditions remained cold and relatively stable for longer periods. The last mainland mammoths disappeared around 10,000 years ago, but isolated populations on Arctic islands survived much longer, with the final mammoths on Wrangel Island living until around 4,000 years ago, contemporary with the ancient Egyptian pyramids. The extinction of mammoths represents one of the great losses of the Ice Age. Megafauna, a suite of large animals that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for hundreds of thousands of years. The debate about the relative contributions of climate change versus human hunting to this extinction continues among scientists, with evidence suggesting that the answer likely varies by species, location, and time period. What seems clear is that mammoths, for all their remarkable adaptations and behavioral sophistication, couldn't cope with the combination of rapid environmental change and a new, highly intelligent predator operating at unprecedented scales. Yet, for hundreds of thousands of years before their extinction, mammoths were one of the great success stories of large mammal evolution. They thrived across an enormous geographic range, survived multiple glacial cycles, and successfully competed with numerous other species for resources. Their adaptations, the fur, the fat, the trunk, the social structure, the behavioral flexibility, represented the culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, fine-tuning an organism to match its environment. The fact that they eventually succumbed to changes beyond their ability to adapt doesn't diminish the remarkable achievement of their long persistence and widespread success. For a mammoth living during the stable period of the Ice Age, life was not a struggle in the dramatic sense, but rather a steady negotiation with a demanding but predictable environment. The cold was constant but manageable. Food required effort to obtain, but was reliably available for those who knew where to look and were willing to work for it. Threats existed, but could be mitigated through vigilance, cooperation, and the wisdom encoded in herd behavior and memory. The overall impression is of a life that was challenging but sustainable, difficult but not desperate, active but not frantic. In imagining the subjective experience of a mammoth, we must be cautious about anthropomorphizing or projecting human emotions and concerns onto an animal with a fundamentally different neurology and existence. Yet mammoths were intelligent, social animals with complex behaviors and long-term memories. It seems reasonable to suggest that a mammoth might have experienced something akin to contentment when feeding in a productive meadow on a calm day, surrounded by familiar herd members. There might have been something like satisfaction in the rhythmic work of feeding, the steady motion of walking, the deep comfort of resting with the herd after a long day. Even if these weren't emotions in the human sense, they were states of being that represented the animal functioning well within its environment, its needs being met, its life unfolding as evolution had prepared it to unfold. The cycle of seasons would have been familiar and, in its own way, comforting. The challenges of each season were known quantities, met with tried and tested strategies. Spring brought new growth and loosening ice. Summer offered abundance and long daylight. Autumn demanded preparation and the building of reserves. Winter required patience, careful resource use, and the tight bonds of the herd. Round and round this cycle turned year after year, generation after generation, with each mammoth living its part in the larger pattern. Within this repeating cycle, individual lives unfolded in their unique ways. Each mammoth had its own experiences, its own relationships, its own subtle variations in how it responded to common situations. Some individuals might have been bolder in exploring new areas, while others preferred the safety of familiar territory. Some might have been more socially connected, with many close bonds within the herd, while others maintained more independence. These individual differences, operating within the broad framework of mammoth biology and behavior, added richness and variation to the species' overall pattern of existence. The knowledge that mammoths carried, both instinctive and learned, was remarkable in its scope and detail. From birth, a calf began absorbing information about its world, the sound of its mother's calls, the scent of herd members, the taste of milk, and later of various plants, the feel of different terrains underfoot, the sight of landmarks and the broader landscape. This learning continued throughout life, with experience layering upon experience, to create a deeply sophisticated understanding of the environment and how to survive within it. An elderly mammoth possessed knowledge about feeding strategies, migration routes, water sources, weather patterns, social dynamics, predator behavior, and countless other topics relevant to survival. An accumulated wisdom earned through decades of direct experience. This knowledge wasn't stored in books or transmitted through language, but it was nonetheless real and powerful. It existed in the neural networks of the mammoth brain, in the patterns of behavior that had been reinforced through repetition, in the social traditions that were passed from older animals to younger, through observation and imitation. When a mammoth died, this knowledge died with it, except for the parts that had been successfully transmitted to the next generation. This made the loss of elderly individuals, particularly experienced matriarchs, a genuine loss to the herd's collective capability. The landscape that mammoths inhabited was not static scenery, but rather a dynamic system that they were part of and that responded to their presence. The paths that herds followed year after year became established trails, compressed and maintained by thousands of mammoth feet. Feeding areas were kept open by constant grazing, preventing shrub and tree encroachment. Water sources were maintained and sometimes excavated by mammoths digging for water during dry periods. In a very real sense, mammoths were ecosystem engineers, shaping their environment in ways that created the conditions they needed to thrive, which in turn supported them in maintaining those conditions. As we consider the full arc of mammoth existence, from the tentative first steps of a newborn calf to the final rest of an elderly individual, we see a life strategy built on patience, persistence, and the power of accumulated knowledge. Mammoths didn't survive through speed, aggression, or rapid reproduction. They survived through being superbly adapted to specific conditions, through maintaining strong social bonds that allowed for collective success, and through behavioral flexibility that let them adjust to variation within the parameters of their fundamental adaptations. The rhythm of mammoth life was slow by human standards. Changes occurred gradually. Skills were learned over years rather than days. Relationships developed over decades. The landscape transformed across millennia. This slowness wasn't a limitation, but rather an adaptation itself, matching the pace at which their environment changed and allowing for the kind of deep, thorough mastery of local conditions that supported long-term survival. In a world where winter was predictable and resources were distributed across vast territories, there was no advantage to rushing and considerable advantage to steady, sustainable patterns of activity. Rest in the mammoth's life was as important as activity. After hours of feeding and traveling, the herd would settle into rest periods, with individuals standing or lying down depending on their age, condition, and preference. Sleep for mammals of this size was necessarily light and intermittent, as the body's enormous mass required constant physiological management, and the risks of deep sleep in a dangerous environment were too high. But these rest periods allowed for physical recovery, for digestive processes to work on the vast quantities of plant material consumed, and for the simple cessation of effort that every living thing requires. During rest periods, social bonding activities might increase. Mammoths standing or lying close together, trunks occasionally touching in gentle contact, vocalizations exchanged at low volume. These were the quiet moments that strengthened the social fabric of the herd. Young calves might engage in play, testing their growing strength and coordination through mock sparring or exploratory wandering under the watchful eyes of adults. These interludes of rest and social connection were woven throughout each day, punctuating the primary activities of feeding and traveling. The sounds of the mammoth world would have been distinctive. The low rumbles of communication between individuals, sometimes at frequencies below human hearing. The rhythmic sounds of chewing and breathing. The crack of breaking ice or wood as tusks were employed. The soft thuds of massive feet on various surfaces. The whistle of wind through long guard hairs. The subtle sounds of a herd in motion, coordinated but not silent. These were the ordinary sounds that filled a mammoth's days, the acoustic landscape as familiar as the visual one. Scent was another crucial sensory modality for mammoths, though one we humans can hardly imagine with our limited olfactory capabilities. The trunk, in addition to its mechanical functions, served as an extraordinarily sensitive scent detection organ. Mammoths could likely detect water from miles away, identify individual herd members by scent, assess the reproductive status of potential mates, detect predators before seeing them, and gather information about their environment through chemical cues we would never notice. This constant stream of scent information would have provided a rich, detailed understanding of the immediate surroundings and changes occurring within them. Touch, too, was important beyond its practical applications. The trunk's sensitivity allowed for delicate exploration and interaction, physical contact between herd members, standing close, trunks touching, calves pressing against, adults, served social and emotional functions in addition to practical ones like heat sharing, grooming behaviors, using the trunk to remove parasites or debris from another individual would have strengthened bonds while serving the practical purpose of maintaining health and comfort. These tactile interactions were part of the everyday texture of social life. Vision in mammoths was probably good, though not exceptional by mammalian standards. The eyes, positioned on the sides of the head, provided a wide field of view that helped detect predators and maintain awareness of herd members' positions. Color vision, if present, would have been useful in assessing plant quality and perhaps in social signaling. The ability to perceive motion was probably well developed, allowing quick detection of approaching threats or straying calves. While vision wasn't the dominant sense the way it is for humans, it was nonetheless an important component of how mammoths perceived and navigated their world. The integration of all these senses, sight, sound, scent, touch, and taste, created a unified perceptual experience that guided behavior and decision-making. A mammoth feeding in a meadow wasn't just mechanically consuming plants, it was simultaneously monitoring the herd's position through sound and peripheral vision, sampling the air for scent information about weather and potential threats, feeling the texture and temperature of plants with its trunk, and tasting what it consumed to assess nutritional value. This constant multisensory monitoring created a richly detailed awareness of the environment that allowed for appropriate responses to changing conditions. Weather, as experienced by a mammoth, was less about daily variations and more about seasonal patterns and occasional extreme events. The daily temperature fluctuations that humans notice were largely irrelevant to animals insulated by fur and fat. What mattered was the broader pattern, whether precipitation was falling as rain or snow, whether wind was strong enough to increase heat loss, whether visibility was reduced by fog or blowing snow, whether ice was forming on water sources. Mammoths responded to these weather patterns behaviorally, seeking shelter when conditions became severe, adjusting travel plans based on ground conditions and timing activities to take advantage of favorable weather windows. The sky above was part of the mammoth's environment in ways both practical and irrelevant. The sun's position helped orient daily and seasonal patterns, with the long summer days of the Arctic allowing for extended feeding periods and the long winter nights requiring rest and energy conservation. The moon and stars might have provided orientation during nighttime travel, though mammoths probably relied more on familiarity with terrain than on celestial navigation. Clouds, wind, and atmospheric conditions provided cues about coming weather changes, though whether mammoths could interpret these cues or simply responded to the changes as they occurred is unclear. The seasonal extremes of the Ice Age Arctic, midnight sun in summer and midday twilight in winter, created dramatically different conditions for activity and rest. During the brief Arctic summer, mammoths could feed almost continuously, taking advantage of the explosive plant growth stimulated by round-the-clock daylight. This was the time for building fat reserves, for growing, for calves to develop strength before winter arrived. During the long Arctic winter, the reduced daylight meant less feeding time and slower digestion, making efficiency and careful energy management critical for survival. The herd's daily rhythm would adjust to these seasonal extremes, remaining flexible while maintaining the basic patterns of feeding, resting, and social interaction. As we draw this exploration of mammoth life toward its close, we return to the fundamental observation that dominated their existence: steadiness. Mammoths were not dramatic creatures, despite their impressive size and iconic appearance. Their lives were characterized by routine, repetition, and the patient application of tried strategies to familiar challenges. This steadiness was their strength, allowing them to persist through countless generations in an environment that was challenging but consistent in its challenges. The individual mammoth, whose life we've traced from birth to death, represents just one thread in an enormous tapestry of mammoth existence stretching across hundreds of thousands of years and millions of individual lives. Each of those lives had its own particular circumstances, its own successes and failures, its own trajectory through the stages of development, maturity, reproduction, and aging. Yet all shared the fundamental patterns we've explored: the importance of the herd, the rhythm of seasons, the central role of feeding, the gradual accumulation of knowledge, and the eventual return to the landscape from which they came. In the quiet darkness of rest, after a day of steady feeding and gentle movement across familiar terrain, a mammoth would stand with its herd, surrounded by the warmth of other massive bodies, the soft sounds of breathing, and occasional vocalizations, the scent of fur and grass and cold air. There was safety in this closeness, comfort in the familiar routine, and a kind of rightness in the match between the animal's capabilities and the demands of its environment. This was a life lived at the appropriate pace for the conditions, neither rushed nor delayed, simply unfolding as generations of evolution had prepared it to unfold. For a human listening to this account while drifting toward sleep, there might be something comforting in contemplating the mammoth's existence. Life reduced to its essentials: food, shelter, social connection, movement through space and time, rest when tired, activity when rested. The mammoth didn't worry about past or future, didn't question its choices, didn't lie awake, troubled by abstract concerns. It simply lived, adapted, and eventually died, participating in cycles far larger and older than any individual life. There's a simplicity to this that can feel restful to contemplate. The mammoth moved through its world with the patience born of evolutionary time, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of selection for the traits and behaviors that worked in Ice Age conditions, every aspect of its biology made sense in context. The fur for insulation, the fat for energy storage, the trunk for manipulation and sensing, the social structure for protection and knowledge transmission, the slow reproduction for stable populations, the long lifespan for accumulating experience. Nothing was random. Everything fit together into a coherent whole, adapted to a specific way of life. In the end, the mammoth's story is one of belonging, belonging to a herd, belonging to a landscape, belonging to a particular moment in Earth's long history. For the hundreds of thousands of years that conditions supported their way of life, mammoths were supremely successful, living lives that worked, that persisted, that mattered in the grand scheme of ecosystem function and evolutionary time. That these conditions eventually changed and mammoths could not adapt quickly enough doesn't diminish the significance of those long millennia of successful existence. As snow falls gently on an ice age landscape, covering the endless tundra in fresh white, a mammoth herd moves slowly through the gathering darkness. Breath fogs and fades, feet compress snow with steady rhythm. Bodies maintain warmth through fur and fat and the simple presence of each other. The wind carries cold across open ground, and the herd walks on, patient and persistent, following routes known through repetition, seeking food and shelter and the continuation of patterns older than memory. This is how it was, season after season, year after year, across vast distances and long time, until eventually it wasn't any more. But for now, in this imagined moment, the herd continues, and the mammoth's life unfolds in its ancient rhythm, neither hurried nor hesitant, simply present in the cold and the darkness and the familiar comfort of movement and rest. The day ends as it began, with feeding and walking and the quiet maintenance of life in challenging conditions. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, and the day after that, and the day after that, in a pattern that has repeated countless times and will repeat countless times more, until the long story finally, gently, comes to rest. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. We'll start by treating a star's life the way we treat any long life, not as one dramatic moment, but as a slow sequence of steady phases that makes sense once you see the pattern. A star is, at its core, a balancing act, gravity pulling inward and energy pushing outward, held in a kind of calm tension that can last for an unimaginably long time. That balance is the sleepy heart of what we're exploring tonight. Even something enormous can spend most of its existence in quiet stability. First comes the before, when there is no star yet, only a spread-out mix of gas and dust in a region of a galaxy where material happens to be a little denser than elsewhere. Picture a cloud in space, not the white puffy kind you see from an airplane window, but something far more diffuse, stretching across distances that would take light years to cross. These clouds are called molecular clouds, and they're made mostly of hydrogen, the simplest and most abundant element in the universe, along with a smaller amount of helium and just traces of heavier elements. The cloud sits there in the dark between existing stars, cold and dim, with temperatures that might hover around 10 or 20 degrees above absolute zero. At those temperatures, molecules move sluggishly, and the cloud seems almost perfectly still from a human perspective. Though, of course, nothing in space is ever truly motionless. Over time, tiny differences in density matter. Gravity doesn't need urgency, it only needs patience. Even in a cloud this spread out, where atoms are separated by vast empty spaces, gravity is always present, always pulling. Every particle of matter attracts every other particle, even if the force is vanishingly small. In most of the cloud, this gentle inward pull is balanced by the slight outward pressure from the random motion of gas particles, and perhaps by magnetic fields threading through the cloud. But in regions where the cloud happens to be just a little denser, perhaps because of a passing shock wave from a nearby supernova, or the compression from a spiral arm of the galaxy, or simply random fluctuation, gravity has a bit more to work with. In these slightly denser regions, the pull becomes incrementally stronger because there's more mass in a given volume, and that stronger pull attracts more material from the surroundings, which makes the region denser still, which increases the gravitational pull further. It's a feedback loop, but one that unfolds over timescales that make human lifetimes look like quick flickers. The cloud slowly gathers itself, and as it gathers, it begins to change state, not suddenly, but inevitably, becoming more compact, more coherent, more like a single future object rather than a loose environment. As the material falls inward, it doesn't fall perfectly. The cloud has some rotation to begin with, inherited from the motion of the galaxy itself and from local turbulence in the interstellar medium. Angular momentum means it tends to flatten into a rotating structure as it contracts, much like a spinning ice skater pulls in their arms and spins faster, or like pizza dough spreads into a disk when you spin it. The collapsing cloud forms what astronomers call a protostellar disk, with material spiraling inward toward a growing central concentration. Collisions within the gas turn motion into heat. When gas particles fall toward the center, they speed up, converting gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy, the energy of motion. But these particles don't fall in isolation. They bump into other particles, and those collisions randomize the directed inward motion into random thermal motion, which we experience as heat. The temperature starts to climb, especially near the center, where the density is highest and collisions are most frequent. At this stage, the star is still a work in progress, a protostar, fed by continuing inflow from the surrounding disk and envelope, growing more massive, more pressurized, and warmer at its center. Nothing about this is quick. The main idea is accumulation, matter arriving, settling, and tightening the conditions needed for the next step. A protostar might take hundreds of thousands of years to form, maybe a few million years, depending on the details of the cloud and how much material is available. During this time, the protostar is hidden inside a thick cocoon of dust and gas, so we can't see it in visible light, but it glows brightly in infrared, because the heat from all that infalling material radiates outward at wavelengths our eyes can't detect, but our instruments can measure. The protostar continues to contract under its own gravity, and as it does, the core temperature rises. At first, the temperatures are only in the thousands of degrees, hot by everyday standards, but not nearly hot enough for what comes next. The protostar is supported partly by the thermal pressure of the hot gas, and partly by the pressure that comes from the fact that the gas hasn't yet settled into a stable configuration. It's still adjusting, still finding its shape. Jets of material sometimes shoot out from the poles of the rotating disk, carrying away excess angular momentum and allowing more material to spiral inward. These jets can stretch for light years, visible in certain wavelengths as beautiful streamlined structures threading through the surrounding cloud. Eventually, the central pressure and temperature climb high enough that the star's true engine can begin. The core temperature reaches about 10 million degrees Kelvin, a threshold where something remarkable becomes possible. At these temperatures, hydrogen nuclei, which are just single protons, the simplest atomic nucleus, are moving fast enough to overcome the electrical repulsion that normally keeps them apart. Protons are positively charged, and like charges repel, so under normal circumstances they push each other away. But at 10 million degrees, the thermal speeds are so high that when protons collide, they can get close enough for the strong nuclear force to take over. The strong nuclear force is one of the fundamental forces of nature, and it operates only at extremely short ranges. But when it does operate, it's powerful enough to bind protons together despite their electrical repulsion. The first sustained nuclear fusion in the core marks the transition from forming to being. Hydrogen nuclei start combining into helium through a series of reactions collectively known as the proton-proton chain, or, in more massive stars, the carbon-nitrogen-oxygen cycle. Either way, the end result is the same. 4 hydrogen nuclei fuse to create one helium nucleus, and in the process, a small amount of mass is converted directly into energy according to Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. That small amount of mass produces an enormous amount of energy, because the speed of light squared is such a large number. This energy emerges as high energy, photons, gamma rays, and as kinetic energy of the resulting particles. The gamma rays immediately start bouncing around inside the dense core, scattering off electrons and ions, gradually working their way outward through the star. This journey from core to surface can take tens of thousands of years, even though the photons are traveling at the speed of light, because they're constantly being absorbed and re-emitted, taking a random walk through the star's interior. And the star finally becomes what we recognize as a stable light source, not because it is finished changing, but because it has found a self-correcting rhythm. The energy generated by fusion in the core creates an outward pressure that pushes against the inward pull of gravity, and these two forces balance each other. This balance is called hydrostatic equilibrium, and it's the defining characteristic of a star that has reached the main sequence, the long, stable phase of its life. Now we settle into the longest portion of a typical star's life, the main sequence. This is the era of steadiness. For a star like our Sun, the main sequence lasts about 10 billion years. More massive stars burn through their fuel faster and have shorter main sequence lifetimes, perhaps only a few million years for the most massive stars. Less massive stars burn their fuel more slowly and can remain on the main sequence for tens of billions of years, longer than the current age of the universe. But regardless of mass, the main sequence is characterized by this fundamental stability, this balance between gravity and pressure. Fusion in the core produces energy. That energy creates outward pressure. Gravity counters it, and the star holds its shape in hydrostatic equilibrium. If the core tries to contract, it heats up and fusion speeds up, pushing outward a little more. If it expands too much, it cools and fusion slows, allowing gravity to pull it back in. The star doesn't decide to be stable. It simply behaves, according to physics that naturally damp extremes. This kind of self-regulating system is called a negative feedback loop, and it's one of the reasons stars are so stable. Think of it like a thermostat in your home. When the temperature drops below the set point, the heater turns on. When it rises above the set point, the heater turns off. The system naturally keeps the temperature near the target. A star does something similar, but instead of a thermostat, it's the relationship between temperature, pressure, and fusion rate that provides the regulation. The star is constantly making tiny adjustments, responding to small fluctuations, keeping itself in balance without any conscious effort or external control. In this long middle, the star becomes a dependable feature of its neighborhood. It steadily converts hydrogen into helium, and over vast time, it changes gradually in ways that don't feel dramatic from moment to moment. If you could watch a main sequence star for 1,000,000 years, you'd notice very little change in its appearance. It would shine with the same brightness, the same color, the same steady output. But over hundreds of millions or billions of years, subtle shifts do occur. The core slowly becomes richer in helium ash. Every time 4 hydrogen nuclei fuse into one helium nucleus, that helium nucleus sinks toward the center of the core because it's heavier than hydrogen. The helium doesn't participate in the proton-proton fusion reactions. It's essentially inert at these temperatures. So gradually, the core develops a growing concentration of helium, while the hydrogen fuel becomes more concentrated in a shell around this helium-rich center. As the helium builds up, the conditions for fusion drift. The mean molecular weight of the core material increases. That is, the average mass per particle goes up because helium nuclei are about 4 times heavier than hydrogen nuclei. This increased weight means that for the same pressure, the core has to be denser and hotter to support itself against gravity. So over time, the core contracts slightly and heats up slightly, and the fusion rate increases slightly. For a sun-like star, brightness tends to creep upward over time, not as a sudden flare, but as a slow adjustment as the core composition changes and the balance point shifts. Our own sun has brightened by about 30% since it first settled onto the main sequence 4.5 billion years ago, and it will continue to brighten slowly as it ages. This brightening is so gradual that over human timescales it's completely imperceptible, but over geological timescales it has significant effects on planetary climates. There's a comforting lesson here. A star is not stable because nothing changes. It is stable because it changes in a controlled way. It is constantly responding to itself, constantly rebalancing. And that's a useful thought for sleep. Your body also rebalances quietly all night long without needing your attention, without needing you to fix anything. Your heart rate slows, your breathing deepens, your temperature drops slightly, your brain cycles through different stages of sleep. All of this happens automatically, governed by feedback loops and regulatory systems built into your biology. Just as a star's stability is built into its physics, the star continues its patient work. In the core, the fusion reactions proceed at a rate determined by the temperature and density. Each reaction converts a tiny amount of mass into energy, and that energy works its way outward through the star. In the deep interior, energy moves by radiation, photons bouncing from particle to particle. But in the outer layers, where the temperature is lower and the gas is less ionized, the opacity increases and radiation becomes inefficient. Here, energy is transported by convection instead. Convection is the same process that makes water boil in a pot or creates weather patterns in Earth's atmosphere. Hot, material rises because it's less dense than its surroundings, and cool material sinks because it's more dense. In the outer layers of a sun-like star, this creates vast convective cells where hot gas rises toward the surface, cools by radiating energy into space, and then sinks back down to be reheated. These convection currents create the granulated appearance we see on the sun's surface, where each granule is the top of a convective cell, perhaps 1,000 kilometers across. The surface itself, the photosphere, is the visible layer from which light can escape directly into space. Below this layer, the gas is opaque enough that photons are constantly absorbed and re-emitted. Above it, the gas is so thin that photons can travel freely. The photosphere is only a few hundred kilometers thick, incredibly thin compared to the sun's radius of nearly 700,000 kilometers. But it's the layer we see when we look at the sun. The photosphere isn't perfectly smooth and uniform. It's marked by sunspots, darker regions where strong magnetic fields suppress convection and slightly cool the surface. It's crossed by faculae, brighter regions also associated with magnetic activity. The sun's magnetic field is generated by the motion of electrically conducting plasma in the convective zone through a process called the dynamo effect. As the sun rotates and convection stirs the plasma, electric currents are generated, and these currents create magnetic fields. The fields emerge through the surface, creating complex structures that evolve over time. The sun's rotation isn't uniform. It rotates faster at the equator than at the poles, a phenomenon called differential rotation. This differential rotation winds up the magnetic field lines, stretching and twisting them until they become tangled and stressed. Eventually, the field lines can snap and reconnect, releasing energy in the form of solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These are dramatic events by solar standards, but they're powered by magnetic energy stored in the sun's outer layers, not by changes in the fusion rate in the core. The core continues its steady work, unperturbed by the magnetic storms happening at the surface. Above the photosphere is the chromosphere, a thin layer where the temperature actually increases with height, contrary to what you might expect. Above that is the corona, the sun's outer atmosphere, where temperatures soar to millions of degrees, even though it's far from the heat source in the core. The mechanism that heats the corona is still not fully understood, but it likely involves magnetic energy being dissipated as waves and reconnection events. The corona is visible during a total solar eclipse as a pearly white halo around the dark disk of the moon, and it's the source of the solar wind, a stream of charged particles that flows outward through the solar system. But all of this activity at the surface and in the atmosphere is, in a sense, superficial. The star's true nature is determined by what happens in the core, and in the core, the fusion continues steadily, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. The hydrogen is consumed, the helium accumulates, and the star slowly evolves. Eventually, the star reaches a turning point when the hydrogen in its core becomes scarce for core fusion. This happens when roughly 10% of the core's hydrogen has been converted to helium, not because all the hydrogen is gone, but because the conditions for fusion become unfavorable as the helium concentration builds up. The star doesn't run out in a dramatic sense. It transitions. The core fusion of hydrogen gradually slows and then ceases, not because the temperature drops, but because there's not enough hydrogen left in the core to sustain the reactions. But fusion can continue in a shell around the core where hydrogen still exists. The core itself, now made almost entirely of helium, begins to contract under gravity because it's no longer supported by fusion energy. As it contracts, it heats up due to gravitational compression, the same process that heated the protostar long ago. This heat radiates outward into the hydrogen-burning shell, increasing the temperature there, and actually accelerating the fusion rate in the shell compared to what it was in the core during the main sequence. The shell fusion produces energy at a higher rate than the core fusion did, and this extra energy pushes the outer layers of the star outward. The star's structure becomes more layered. Different kinds of fusion and different physical conditions in different regions, like a life becoming more complex with age. The star is leaving its long, steady adulthood and moving into a later life phase. This is the beginning of the red giant stage. For a modest, sun-like star, this later phase often includes expansion into a red giant. The details can be explained gently. As the core contracts and shell fusion intensifies, the outer layers puff outward. They expand to many times the star's original radius. Our sun, when it becomes a red giant in about 5 billion years, will swell to perhaps 100 times its current radius, large enough to engulf the inner planets, including Earth. But despite this enormous increase in size, the outer layers actually cool because the same amount of energy is being spread over a much larger surface area. A cool surface radiates light that's redder than a hot surface, which is why these stars are called red giants. Their surface temperature might drop to around 3,000 or 4,000 degrees Kelvin, compared to the sun's current surface temperature of about 5,700 degrees Kelvin. The cooler temperature means the light is shifted toward the red end of the spectrum, giving the star a distinctly orange or reddish color. The transition to a red giant doesn't happen overnight. It takes tens or hundreds of millions of years, depending on the star's mass. During this time, the star brightens considerably because even though the surface is cooler, the vastly increased surface area means the total energy output, the luminosity, is much higher. A red giant can be hundreds or thousands of times more luminous than it was on the main sequence. The expanded outer envelope of a red giant is only loosely bound to the star. The gravitational pull at the surface is weak because the mass is the same, but the radius is much larger, and gravity decreases with the square of the distance. Meanwhile, radiation pressure, the outward pressure exerted by the star's light, becomes more effective at pushing material outward. The star begins to lose mass through a stellar wind, a gentle but persistent outflow of gas from the surface. This isn't a violent explosion. It's more like evaporation, material slowly drifting away into space. Inside the star, the helium core continues to contract and heat up. If the star's mass is in the right range, roughly half a solar mass or more, the core can eventually become hot and dense enough to fuse helium into heavier elements. The temperature needed for helium fusion is much higher than for hydrogen fusion, about 100 million degrees Kelvin, because helium nuclei have 2 protons each, and thus a stronger electrical repulsion to overcome. When the core reaches this temperature, helium fusion begins. The primary reaction is called the triple alpha process because it involves 3 helium nuclei, also called alpha particles, Two helium nuclei fuse to form an unstable beryllium nucleus, and if a third helium nucleus collides with it quickly enough before it decays, they fuse to form a stable carbon nucleus. This process also releases energy, though less energy per reaction than hydrogen fusion. Sometimes the carbon nucleus can capture another helium nucleus to form oxygen. So the products of helium fusion are carbon and oxygen, and these accumulate in the core just as helium accumulated during hydrogen fusion. This helium burning period is another chapter of temporary steadiness, shorter than the main sequence, but still governed by the same theme: balance found, held for a time, then slowly altered as fuel and conditions evolve. For a sun-like star, helium fusion lasts perhaps 100 million years, much shorter than the 10 billion year main sequence lifetime. More massive stars burn helium faster, less massive stars burn it more slowly, if they can ignite it at all. Stars less than about half a solar mass never get hot enough to fuse helium. Their helium cores just sit there, contracting and heating, but never reaching the ignition temperature, supported eventually by a quantum mechanical effect called electron degeneracy pressure rather than by thermal pressure. Each new fuel stage is like a new season, distinct but not chaotic. The star burns helium in its core while continuing to burn hydrogen in a shell around the core. The energy from both fusion zones supports the star against gravity, and the star settles into a new equilibrium, though a more complex one than during the main sequence. The structure now has multiple layers: a carbon-oxygen core, a helium-burning shell, a helium-rich layer, a hydrogen-burning shell, and an extended hydrogen envelope. As the star continues, it cannot fuse heavier and heavier elements indefinitely unless it is very massive. The energy released per fusion reaction decreases as you go to heavier elements, and the temperature required for fusion increases. Carbon fusion requires about 600 million degrees. Oxygen fusion requires over 1 billion degrees. For stars with masses less than about 8 times the Sun's mass, the core never gets hot enough for carbon fusion. The star's journey through the periodic table stops at carbon and oxygen. For our average life story, focused on peaceful endings, we stay with a star that does not end in a violent collapse. A star, like the Sun, will never undergo carbon fusion. Instead, as it exhausts the helium in its core, the core contracts again, heats again, and fusion moves to shells around the core. The star becomes more unstable, pulsating and shedding mass more vigorously. It gradually sheds its outer layers through an increasingly strong stellar wind and through pulses of mass loss, during which the star brightens and expands, then fades and contracts over timescales of thousands of years. This shedding can be framed as a release rather than a destruction. Material that was held close by gravity for eons is finally returned to space, carrying with it elements made inside the star. The hydrogen envelope drifts away as an expanding shell of gas, illuminated by the ultraviolet light from the hot core. This glowing shell is called a planetary nebula, a misleading name chosen by early astronomers who thought these fuzzy round objects looked like planets through their telescopes. Planetary nebulae are among the most beautiful objects in the sky, with intricate shapes and brilliant colors. They can be round, elliptical, or bizarrely complex, with shells, jets, knots, and filaments. The shapes are determined by the star's rotation, magnetic fields, and whether the star has a companion. The colors come from emission lines of different elements, oxygen glowing green, hydrogen glowing red, nitrogen glowing red, each element emitting light at specific wavelengths when energized by the central star's radiation. But the nebula is ephemeral. It expands and disperses over tens of thousands of years, mixing with the interstellar medium and disappearing from view. What remains is the core remnant, a white dwarf. This is a small, dense object, supported not by ongoing fusion, but by the quantum rules that prevent matter from being squeezed infinitely. It no longer generates energy the way it once did. It simply holds heat and slowly cools over a very long time, fading gradually, quietly dimming rather than abruptly ending. A white dwarf is incredibly dense. It has roughly the mass of the sun packed into a sphere about the size of Earth. A teaspoon of white dwarf material would weigh several tons on Earth. This density is possible because the atoms are crushed so close together that the electrons are stripped from their nuclei. The matter is in a state called electron-degenerate matter, where the electrons are packed as tightly as the laws of quantum mechanics allow. The quantum mechanical principle that prevents further collapse is called the Pauli exclusion principle. It states that no two electrons can occupy the same quantum state simultaneously. As the white dwarf contracts, the electrons are forced into higher and higher energy states because the lower states are all occupied. This creates a pressure, degeneracy pressure, that doesn't depend on temperature, but only on density. This pressure supports the white dwarf against gravity, and it's strong enough to hold the star up even, though there's no fusion happening. In sleep story terms, it is a life that finishes its work and then rests. The white dwarf has no energy source, no fusion burning in its interior. It simply radiates away the heat left over from its previous life. When it first forms, a white dwarf can have a surface temperature of 100,000 degrees, Kelvin or more, making it appear blue-white and extremely bright despite its small size. But over time, it cools. The final stretch lingers on cooling as a kind of cosmic letting go. The white dwarf radiates away its remaining heat, becoming darker and colder as time passes. There is no deadline in this phase, just a gentle slide toward stillness. The cooling process is extraordinarily slow because white dwarfs have a large heat capacity and a small surface area. Theoretical calculations suggest that it takes tens of billions of years for a white dwarf to cool from 100,000 degrees to just a few thousand degrees. The oldest white dwarfs we've observed in our galaxy have cooled for about 10 billion years, roughly the age of the galaxy's oldest stars. They're faint and difficult to detect, glowing with the dim red light of embers that have been cooling for eons. Eventually, after trillions of years, far longer than the universe has existed so far, a white dwarf will cool to the point where it no longer emits visible light at all. It becomes a black dwarf, a dark, cold sphere of degenerate matter, a stellar corpse in the truest sense. But we've never seen a black dwarf because the universe isn't old enough yet. Every white dwarf that has ever formed is still warm enough to glow, at least faintly. The black dwarf stage is purely theoretical, a prediction of what will happen in the unimaginably distant future, when the universe is much older and colder than it is now. The star's story doesn't end with noise. It ends with patience, like a long exhale. There's something peaceful about this ending. The star doesn't fight against its fate. It doesn't struggle or resist. It simply cools, following the path laid out by physics, taking as long as it needs. There's no urgency, no panic, no drama, just a slow, steady decline into darkness and quiet. We close by, widening the perspective. The matter the star released becomes part of the galaxy's ongoing cycle. Gas that can join new clouds, dust that can seed future systems, elements that make later stars and planets more chemically rich. The planetary nebula disperses, spreading the carbon and oxygen made in the star's core, along with traces of other elements, into the surrounding space. This enriched gas mixes with pristine hydrogen and helium left over from the Big Bang, and the mixture becomes the raw material for the next generation of stars. This is how the galaxy evolves chemically over time. The first stars formed from pure hydrogen and helium with almost no heavier elements at all. When those stars died, they returned their material to space, now enriched with carbon, oxygen, and other elements. The next generation of stars formed from this slightly enriched gas, and when they died, they enriched it further. Generation after generation, the interstellar medium becomes richer in heavy elements, and each new generation of stars and planets forms from more chemically diverse material. Our own sun is a third-generation star, maybe fourth, formed from gas that had been cycled through previous stars. The elements in our bodies, the carbon in our cells, the oxygen we breathe, the calcium in our bones, the iron in our blood, were all made inside stars and scattered into space when those stars died. We are, quite literally, made of stardust, assembled from atoms forged in stellar cores and dispersed by stellar winds and supernovae. The star's life, even in its quiet ending, contributes to beginnings elsewhere, and that's the soft landing, a reminder that steadiness is real. Cycles are natural, and you don't have to force anything. Tonight, the universe operates on cycles that span billions of years, cycles of birth and death and rebirth, of matter being transformed and recycled, of energy flowing from stars into space and being captured by planets and living things. These cycles don't require our attention or our effort. They proceed according to the laws of physics, unfolding at their own pace, indifferent to our worries or plans. There's something comforting in that perspective, the knowledge that the universe has been taking care of itself for nearly 14 billion years without any help from us, and it will continue to do so long after we're gone. To bring it back to sleep, we return to the central metaphor of balance, gravity and pressure, inward and outward, held in calm tension. If a star can spend most of its existence simply rebalancing and shining without strain, you can borrow that feeling now. Your body knows how to rest. Your brain knows how to sleep. The systems are already in place. The feedback loops already operating. The balance already being maintained. You don't have to figure out how to fall asleep any more than a star has to figure out how to shine. The process is built in, encoded in your biology, as fundamental as fusion is to a star. All you need to do is allow it to happen. Let go of the effort. Let go of the trying. Just be here, in this moment, in this comfortable position, breathing slowly and steadily. Let your breathing become your equilibrium. Inhale, exhale, and allow everything else to find its own quiet place in the dark. Notice how your breath flows in and out without you having to think about it. How your body knows exactly how much air to take in, when to let it out, how deep or shallow to breathe for this particular moment. It's a self-regulating system, adjusting constantly to your needs without any conscious input. Your heart does the same thing, beating steadily, speeding up when you need more oxygen, slowing down when you're at rest, your blood pressure, your body temperature, your hormone levels. All of these are regulated by feedback loops that operate automatically, keeping you in balance just as gravity and fusion pressure keep a star in balance. And just as a star slowly dims as it releases its heat into space, you can imagine yourself slowly releasing the heat of the day, the thoughts, the worries, the tensions, letting them radiate away into the quiet darkness of your bedroom. There's no need to hold on to them. They can drift away like the gas from a planetary nebula, dispersing harmlessly, leaving you cooler and calmer and more still. Think about the white dwarf, that small, dense remnant, no longer burning, no longer striving, just resting and cooling, taking all the time in the world. There's no rush. There's nowhere to be, nothing to do. Just this gentle slide toward stillness, this peaceful letting go of heat and light and energy, until all that's left is quiet darkness and rest. The universe is very old and very patient. It has been through countless cycles of star formation and death, each one taking millions or billions of years. From the universe's perspective, your night of sleep is less than an instant, a flicker too brief to measure. But it's your instant, your flicker, and it's valuable. It's the time when your body repairs itself, when your brain consolidates memories and clears out metabolic waste, when your immune system does its most important work. Sleep is your body's way of maintaining balance, just as fusion is a star's way of maintaining balance. And just as fusion happens automatically when the conditions are right, sleep happens automatically when you let it. The conditions are right now. You're lying down. You're comfortable. You're safe. It's dark and quiet. Your body knows what to do. So let the stellar cycle continue in your mind if it helps. Imagine clouds of gas slowly contracting, protostars forming, main sequence stars burning steadily for billions of years, red giants expanding and pulsing, white dwarfs cooling slowly in the dark. Let the images be vague and dreamy, not something you have to think about actively, just a gentle background drift of thoughts that don't demand your attention, or let the thoughts go entirely. Let there be nothing but breath, nothing but the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the cool air flowing in through your nose, the warm air flowing out. Let there be nothing but the weight of your body on the bed, the softness of the pillow, the warmth of the blankets. Let there be nothing but this moment, this quiet, this stillness. The stars will continue their work without you. The galaxy will keep turning. The universe will keep expanding. And you can rest, knowing that everything is proceeding as it should, that the great cycles continue, that balance is maintained. You can let go and drift, let go and sink, let go and fall into the gentle darkness that's been waiting for you all along. The star shines because it must, because the physics of its core gives it no choice. And you sleep because you must, because the biology of your brain gives you no choice. Once you stop resisting, once you stop trying so hard, sleep isn't something you do. It's something that happens to you when you get out of the way. So get out of the way now. Stop trying. Stop thinking about sleeping. Just lie here and breathe and let the darkness take you, gently, slowly, like a white dwarf cooling into silence, like a star fading at the end of its long, bright life, like all things returning to the quiet from which they came.